And I saw Brett's hand.
Yeah, I see you, Brett. And I forgot to announce the recording piece. So thanks, Jenna, for getting that on there. Go ahead, Brett.
Well, Shannon said the best part, and it went unrecorded, and that's probably all right. But I guess to the elephant in the room, I think the thing I wanted to say, Shannon, is I feel like, well, the financial viability piece is obviously a really high pressured and concerning part of our overall journey right now. And last meeting was a bit of a bruiser, and I think there's been a lot of work done since the last meeting, and thank you to Mike and Eric for being here, but to OSU as well. I think there have been a variety of conversations and a subgroup meeting with a lot of relevant folks outside the board, but also on the board in that conversation. So this is, I think the context is, this is an important issue, and there is ongoing work that I think is making a difference, and we want to be sure we're moving into the retreat with this conversation in mind. And then I'll shut up. I've got a small part on this budget agenda, but I'll hold that.
Great. And just as a reminder, Mike, as we turn it over to you, the folks from the board that volunteered to be a part of the subgroup were Colin, Paul, Keith, Bob Salinger, and then Jennifer initially, but Jennifer also has a new set of responsibilities and is trying to allocate her time a little bit more judiciously in terms of the detailed engagement. So that's the small subgroup or small group that's been working on the detailed sort of financial analysis and input. So with that, Mike, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Peter. Good afternoon, board members, staff, everyone on the call. Mike Buffo, Senior Forest Economist at Mason, Bruce, and Girard. I'll get my screen shared here, and hopefully you're seeing that all right. And I'll go over the long-term financial modeling that we did and kind of give you an overview of the modeling itself and then our results. So specifically, I'll talk about a little bit of background about harvest schedule modeling, and then give the overview of the draft model for the Elliott State Research Forest, and then give you the draft model results. So I just want to start off with defining what a harvest schedule model is. And a harvest schedule model is a model that's a decision support tool that identifies when, where, and how much to harvest over a planning horizon to best achieve a predefined set of objectives. I guess the important phrase here is it's a decision support tool. It's not going to tell you everything you need to know, but it will help you make decisions around long-term planning. Digging a little deeper here, there's different models for different purposes. So you can have strategic, tactical, and operational models. A strategic model is going to look at the long-term policy and financial outcomes, and you can ask questions around, for example, long-term sustained yield, among other questions. At the tactical level, that's modeling that you might use to develop harvest plans for a 5 or 10 year period. And then at the operational level, that's modeling that you might do to develop harvest plans for a shorter period, maybe less than 5 years, or assess equipment utilization or impacts of short-term market changes. The work I'm presenting here today is at the strategic level. So this is looking at long-term planning. If you think about our model, it has a 150-year time horizon in it. I'll show results for a 60-year period, and I'll kind of talk about that when I get there. And just be aware that the work we have to do here is really telling the model what harvest or what management of the forest will look like for 150 years. These are decisions that have not yet been made, so we're just projecting out what may happen in that time. A harvest scheduling model has a number of components. It has information about the land base, the acres, and the allocations, what kind of harvest can happen where riparian areas are, where reserves are, what's intensive, what's extensive. We have yield curves. So this is projections of both initial volume, but importantly, the growth projections into the future. That can be at a strata level or a stand level in general. We have stand level yields in this case. A model needs to have a period, a modeling period, and then a duration. So in this model, we have 5-year time steps and 150-year period. So with the 5-year time step, you don't get resolution that's deeper than that 5 years. You just get a number for a 5-year period. We need a set of financial assumptions around, in this case, log prices, harvest costs, and discount rate. And these apply, of course, over the course of the 150 years. And you can see that a challenge there would be predicting what future log prices are decades in the future. We have assumptions about activities, what types of harvests are allowed, keeping in mind that the actual harvest could differ from what we're modeling, that there's probably a lot more site-specific complexity than we're going to show in the model. We put constraints in around the rules that the model is going to follow. For example, harvest acres or variation in harvest from one year to the next, that's a possible constraint. We don't have anything like that here. I'll talk about that in a slide coming up. And then you need an objective function, just what the model is trying to optimize over the time. It could be harvest volume, it could be net present value. In our case, it's net present value. Turning to the model specifically, the subgroup got a much more detailed rundown of kind of each specific set of assumptions around those general categories that I just listed, but I'll highlight a few key things here today for this group. That is that there's 2 scenarios that we're going to look at today, and they differ in the harvest growth rate assumptions. We have a faster growth rate and a slower growth rate assumption. Those are based, both of those assumptions are based on input we got from the advisory committee and then also from OSU. The different outcomes, the different assumptions in growth rate, of course, affect the harvest levels, the acres, and the revenue, which we'll see. Again, there are aspects of the management that aren't finalized, for example, of course, HCP. And so those aren't fully integrated into this model. For activities assumptions, we wanted to consider the application of the study over the 150-year period. So we made some general assumptions of what that would look like. For example, in the intensive allocation, we have regeneration harvest happening at age 60, but no commercial thinning. In the extensive harvest, we have regeneration harvest at age 100. Of course, again, in practice, the prescriptions will likely be much more complicated. We have no thinning in the MRW reserves. And we do include the tune-up or backlog thinning. So this is thinning in areas where OSU has identified where we think thinning will occur to really prepare the forest. I think this is the right way to phrase it, kind of prepare the forest for the study to be applied. And so we have applied that. So, and we applied that entirely in the first period. And you'll see that in the results that there is kind of a high amount of activity in the first period. I don't think that's what, that's not what OSU is planning to do. That's just how we're modeling it. And I'll just put the kind of disclaimer here that implementation will differ from modeling assumptions. There'll be site-specific treatment, there'll be site-specific timing. And then the tune-up thinnings in particular are something that would be applied over a longer period, likely a 20-year period, to do all the activity. Some key constraints in the model, we have the application of the murrelet habitat high retention study. And so there's 500 acres of that allowed between 2025 and 2035 in the model. If you've seen previous editions of the model and previous results, you saw models that used a non-declining yield constraint. So there was a requirement that the harvest in each period, each 5-year period, had to be either the same as the period before it or increasing. So I think there was actually a slight amount of variation allowed in those. But in this case, there's no such constraints. So there can be larger swings in harvest between periods. And that's commensurate with the application of the study, given a more age-based set of harvest scenarios that we put into this, like I described. We don't have a harvest activity cap, and that's been an area of discussion that's not represented here. And there is, we don't have a constraint for the 2-to-1 ratio of intensive versus extensive per acre volume production. But we don't have that because our the scenarios, the harvest scenarios we have for the extensive harvest don't really fully show what activities might happen farther out in the modeling period. We have one entry happening, one regeneration entry happening, but not a second. And since some stands will have that second entry, but we don't have them in the model, we are underreporting what might happen, out many decades in the model. But that would affect a constraint if we put the 2-to-1 requirement into the model. I'm going to show you results for the first 60 years. For the first 60 years, we have a good representation of what would happen under our assumptions on the forest. And so I think those are really where you have the most robust results, is up in that first 60-year period. So turning to those results, I'll look at the first scenario. I have a name here, MAI 500, that just relates to the mean annual increment. And so in this case, we, based on guidance from the advisory committee, came up with a scenario that targeted a mean annual increment of 500 for a certain set of regeneration curves. That's just a set of our yield curves. And so for this group, importantly, this is just the lower level of yields that we ran, the lower growth rates that we ran. You can see here, I also have a kind of a lengthy note around what's going on in period one. As I said before, we have the tune-up activities happening in the first decade. There's also, the model will do treatments on intensive stands that are over 60 years old in the first period, as well as treatments on extensive stands that are over 100 years old, regeneration activities on extensive stands that are over 100 years old in the first period. So you get a kind of a surge of activity in the first period. That doesn't represent what actual management on the forest will look like. That's kind of an artifact of modeling with our kind of simplified assumptions that we made. So what I've also done here is provided information averaged out over a 20-year period, which probably more closely represents what may happen in terms of volume, acres, and revenue here. So for this harvest volume, for the lower yield scenario, the MAI 500 scenario, over that 20-year period, there's nearly 20 million board feet per acre, or sorry, per year, per acre, of course, 20 million board feet per year off the forest, and then decline to around 9 million for the next, actually about 40 years. In terms of revenue, that results out into about $5 million per year for this first 20 years, and around $3 million for subsequent years. And in harvest acres, about just over 1,000 acres in the first per year for the first 20 years, and then down to 200 to 300 for the years after that. These are all averages. In practice, implementation could be different, so there could be more or fewer acres in a given year, say within that first 20-year period. The second scenario here, called the 2020 scenario, had a little bit higher growth rates, actually about maybe about 30 to 40% higher growth rates on certain regeneration stands, but applied to all yields. The kind of subcommittee group, this is something we went more deeply into exactly what's in those yields, but suffice to say, this is a faster growth rate scenario. And you see a bit more harvest out of that, around 22 million board feet per year for the first 20 years, and then about 13 to 14 in the subsequent years. Similarly, revenue is higher at just over 6 million for the first 20 years, per year for the first 20 years, and for almost 5 million subsequently. Again, of course, more in the first period, but again, that just should more appropriately be averaged out over the 20 years. And for harvest acres, about the same, a little bit more with 1,068 acres per year for the first 20 years, and 3 to almost 500 under the subsequent 40 years. So any questions about the model or the results? I'm happy to go back to any slides if needed.
Thanks, Mike. Any comments or questions from the board?
I see a couple of hands up. Peter, do you see those as well?
I'm not seeing them. Sorry.
Okay, I see
there they
Mike.
are. Okay, let me go.
Has a hand up.
Yeah, Mike, and then Teresa's got him now.
Okay, thanks, Mike. So questions, just out of curiosity, why didn't you model the initial, I forget what you called it, but the extra volume over the 4-year period rather than four periods rather than all in the first one?
Yeah, why is it that it's all aggregated to the first period?
Yeah.
Yeah. So to spread it out over the 4 periods, we need to know some information about how to do that. And as it is, it would be done by net present value. So it would be we'd be letting the model kind of choose for us what stands to harvest when. And if there are other considerations for when stands should be harvested, that's something we want to take into account. So we kind of push that all into the first period to really kind of simplify, really have more control over what we know the model is doing, as opposed to letting the model do its work from a net present value perspective.
Okay, and could I ask what model you're using?
Yeah, well, we're using I don't know formally the name of it, but it's the model run by John Sessions at OSU.
Okay. And just a little comment, whenever we've been doing any type of modeling and projections for future, I know you've got 2 different scenarios here, and we've always, whenever we're doing this type of work, we'll always choose the one that shows the lower amount of volume of revenue, because I would much rather tell my bosses that we exceeded expectations rather than didn't come anywhere close. So I would definitely encourage everybody to be looking at the lower scenario for volume and for revenue. So.
Thanks, Mike. Teresa?
I just had a quick question. Did you say that second scenario was the main difference was a higher growth rate that you were using?
That's right. Yeah, there's 2 different growth rates here. So they differ by growth rate.
So if it's growth rate, then why are the acreages different?
Yeah, well, so there is differences in what meets the other standards for harvest. So there's still the same requirements for minimum harvest, like minimum harvest requirements and acres kind of available to the model. Future harvest increases because of the here around again, I think what becomes eligible for harvest under the rules within the model.
That
Okay.
question. Go ahead, Teresa, follow up.
I guess I still don't understand why a different growth rate solely would change that, but that is okay.
Okay, I need to get back to you with a better, more complete explanation, but I'll leave it there for now.
Great. Any other comments or questions?
Yeah, Mike, this is Brett Brownscombe. Thanks for the presentation. So I think you said one of the constraints or lack of constraints is no harvest cap or no age-based harvest cap. So did you run it with no harvest cap period, or is there a distinction between age-based harvest cap and not running it with a harvest cap period?
There's certainly no acres cap in it. So is in terms of age based, I would have to go back to what the I don't know offhand what the rules are around operable acres, what stands can be operated on, but they'd be the same in both of these, and I believe would not have changed from prior versions of the model. But the cap I was referring to was the acres.
If I could just ask Mike a question and then just add on a couple of things that might be a little bit more clarifying. On the harvest cap, so these draft scenario runs were done earlier in 2023 with the idea that this gives us the ability to use updated data and updated assumptions, including input that we've gotten from advisory committee members and consultants. And then the conversation happening around the harvest cap and marbled mirrolets, any other adjustments, those are layers that can be added to future modeling scenarios. So that's why the harvest cap isn't included in this one, because we didn't have the numbers that we could put into the model, or that we could ask Mason, Bruce, and Gerard to put in the model. But once those are finalized, then we'd be able to do that. Same thing with any adjustments based on mirrolets from what's currently modeled right now. I think, Mike, you showed that there's 500 acres of high retention extensive in murrelet occupied habitat, and that's based on the murrelet experiment that's in the research design. And then that's it. There's no other high retention harvests in occupied or modeled potential murrelet habitat in this version. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah, just the 500 acres.
And then one clarification too. I know you're talking about the differences between growth rates in these two models. Could you talk a little bit about how those compared to previous modeling efforts and
Yeah.
where the growth rates came from that are currently being modeled in these two scenarios?
Yeah, for sure. So they're substantially lower than in previous editions. So the original yield curves were built from FBS Organon, and the 2020 scenario is actually named that because it's a 20% reduction in growth rates on current stands as well as the regeneration stands. And so the regeneration stands are the yield curves that are used after a regeneration harvest within the model. The MAI 50, MAI 500 scenario is a 56% reduction in growth rates from what Organon produces. The MAI 500 was recommended by the advisory board, and that we also had done, and as was actually the 2020 scenario. The 2020 scenario is more closely similar to some work from OSU that comes from the Sipsonon work or program. We also called consultants that work in the area to do a poll of MAI values that folks see, and also looked at some of our own data that we had available to us around MAIs in that area, and found a range. Some folks find below, on some stands below 500 MAI, up to 700 to 800, and if the and potentially higher in some areas. The 2020 scenario, if I call it by its MAI value, would be around about 7. I want to say 760 or 770. I saw a comment that it looked like Teresa said it helped answer her question. I do also want to do a little go back to Teresa's question about the difference in acres. The model is driven by net present value, so growth rate would affect net present value and the viability of harvest to generate net present value. So I think that's also where you're seeing more acres in a higher growth rate stands, that there's the the potential for more basically more viable harvests from a net present value perspective.
Great, thanks, Mike, and thanks for the questions. Any other questions or comments? And then I also just wanted to take a moment and note, Vice Chair Systream, your comment and question about posting or sharing the presentation, and we'll make sure to get that to you and available to folks. And then, Vice Chair, I didn't know, since you're here with us, as well as Councilwoman Helms, if you wanted to make any statements on behalf of the council, knowing that Colin is not here to represent the tribe. If you'd like to do so, I just wanted to give you the opportunity.
Thank you so much for allowing us to speak today. I am Julie Seastrom. I'm Hannes Coos, and currently Vice Chair for our Tribal Council of the Confederated Tribes of Coos, Lower Umpqua, and Sayusla Indians. And I cannot speak for Colin. He's our expert. So I'm just going to say thank you so much for the work that you're doing for and with us in the best interests of our general membership in relationship to our forests. We humbly thank you, and please keep doing the work. And again, also please do share the PowerPoints as you can with us, and then we can share it with the rest of our general council. And I don't know if Anna wants to say anything or not, but she's also here, and she's one of our tribal council members. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Chair. Okay. And Councilwoman, if you'd like to make a statement, feel free to do so now, or just send me a chat and we'll make sure to find a time for you. And with that, we'll transition Eric to you for the work that you've been doing.
All right, thanks. All right, so kind of piggybacking on the work that Mason, Bruce, and Gerard was doing. The college asked, we kind of ran into a question of what this thing to advance. Oh boy, here we go. Okay. The model, the bigger model is a little hard to run quick scenarios and to adjust inputs. And so they wanted something that they could test the financial outcomes and do some sensitivity analysis on these different scenarios that would be combinations of acres and volume. With the help of the OSU team, we came together and built a model. We call it the simple financial model because this is it. It's a spreadsheet. It has a lot of dials and knobs that you can turn. We've got assumptions built into it for the logging costs and all of your costs, your revenues. And so we can adjust those and then see what the outcome turns into. We also build in how many acres per year and volume per acre. We make some adjustments for the fact that not all acres are covered with trees. So there's a reduction if they're to try and account for rock faces and wet areas that aren't fully stocked. So we've got an ability to enter in the volume per acre and then make adjustments for what may be a modeled ideal volume per acre versus what we see on the ground or what would be realized. And there's a lot of things that go into that with breakage when you actually fall the tree, any grade defects or things that we just can't see on the outside. So if we look at the assumption, we kind of talked about the assumptions, we'll kind of keep moving on. Log sales, that's another big driver over here. So when we look at what goes into the model and what are the significant inputs, your modeled regen, the amount of intensive regen is very important because those acres are going to be what generates most of the revenue that the forest is going to receive. The thinning, because it costs more, is going to really hopefully break even, but we don't expect to receive much net revenue off of those. So and then of course your volume per acre and your log sales are going to be real important. The outputs, kind of as you follow along all the way to the right hand side, we have net stumpage. So that is how many dollars are we going to receive after logging and trucking and timber taxes are removed. So then we still have civiculture and our overhead, which is really the research program, and the agency or the authority's budget is going to have to go in there. So you can see these are old numbers. This was from the first part of March that we had some placeholders in. And then of course the net result, that's the number everybody wants to see. So these numbers are a little bit of an oversimplification from what Mason, Bruce, and Gerard is modeling. They model theirs on a stand by stand basis, and each one of those stands is going to contribute acres, volume, and dollars. And what we're saying is we go back and say, what is the average on the whole period? So this is a 10-year period that we were looking at here, but we could do it on an annual basis, or we could even do it on a harvest unit basis when we get that kind of fidelity. But for now, we're looking at an annual basis, and the averages for volume and acres is based off of a 10-year period. So the big question, everybody, what we're doing is, will it work? And what I'd like to make sure everybody understands is the current question really is about, is it feasible, and not pin the tail on the donkey. So we don't need to know exactly what the growth rate is. We don't need to know exactly what the volume per acre is to be able to say that we have high confidence that the risk of failure is low or the risk of failure is acceptable. So we can adjust the variables in this model and try and come up with what those combination of scenarios look like. And then it'll be for this group to decide if they're comfortable with that risk when we get there. So we did a sensitivity analysis. We ran this with lots of different inputs, and the result is kind of summarized over here in the green and the blue. But the good news is that there are multiple scenarios that have a low risk and appear to be very feasible. So
Eric, that is really small print. Can you make that bigger?
I
have old eyes, but even with old eyes, it's ridiculous.
Yeah, so I'll see if I can zoom a little bit more here. Yeah, this is going to be hard. I can get you a copy of this. The point really is not so much the numbers, because these numbers are going to change when we update budgets and we update acres. But when you put in, this side over here on the left-hand side was using some of the original intensive regen acres of 220 acres. And when you look at some different log sale scenarios and volume per acre scenarios, if you see the blue is a break-even situation, and the green is that it would generate $2 million over and above what the budget requirements are. So the sort of the big, the high level is at 220 acres, you have to have a little bit more aggressive assumptions in order to get to break even and to generate a surplus. If you increase the number of intensive regen acres, and for this example is 400, but that's part of the information that will come out of the strategic modeling and the HCP that will drop into here. You can reduce you don't have to have as aggressive assumptions in order to get to break even or to generate a surplus. And so again, if we have relatively close inputs, I think that there's probably some scenarios that still are low risk and appear feasible, but the detail of exactly where those lines are is going to, once the authority has a budget and the research program budget is more finalized, it'll give you a better sense for where exactly that line is. Let's see if I can.
See a couple questions later.
Thanks.
I've got maybe one more slide, and then we can make one more. We're going the wrong way. That's where my mouse is done.
Yeah, and Jenna's telling us how to zoom in on our own screen, which was awesome, and I can actually see now.
Jenna, do you want to just tell everybody that?
She did. She just sent a note out.
Great. Thanks. If you didn't catch it, it's in the chat. So we'll let Eric go through his last slide or two, and then Vice Chair Seastrom and then Keith will take your questions or comments.
Oh my goodness, this thing's going anyway around me here. Well, we're going to jump out of that. Okay, so really where we're at, the next steps is going to be for the board and OSU are going to need to think about where their risk tolerance on all these different inputs that go into a model like this are. How aggressive do you want to be on log sales, on volume per acre, acres needed, acres that are going to be treated with regen, intensive regen, and then we can rerun the model. Some of the things that are going on right now, OSU is working on sampling some timber crews or some timber inventory data to see how confident we are with that 2015 inventory data. There are some example harvest units that are being created so we can get a little bit of confidence in our logging costs and how much those are going to cost to implement. The treatment allocations, of course, that's going to be a big driver in logging costs. Again, if there's more thinning, those are going to be sort of a break-even treatment versus the regen that are going to generate some revenue. And then, I think there's going to be plenty more talk about budget estimates and refining those as you move forward. So those are sort of the next steps that will help dial this in, and then we can do another round of sensitivity analysis and really show where we are as far as risk tolerance and likelihood of feasibility. So
Thanks, Eric.
Yeah, I think
We've got a couple of,
any questions?
yeah, perfect. Vice Chair Seastrom.
Thank you so much, Eric, for your presentation. I just wanted to double check with you. If I understand the first gentleman's presentation, his was in a draft format and it's not a final version. And I just wanted to double check with yourself that if I got the right impression that this is a work in progress, it's not the final.
Correct. So what we have is sort of a mostly final model. The model can be adjusted. So we need to finalize the inputs that are going to go into that model. So the acres that are going in, the log sale values that we want to use, and what the model is useful for is not to say you're going to make $5 million a year in revenue exactly, or $4.8 million. It's really to say, based on a number of conservative estimates, or a range of estimates, I suppose, how likely is it that we will break even or be slightly positive? And if we can put in all very conservative estimates, sort of to Mike Kennedy's point, and it still shows that it works out, then I think it has very high likelihood of being feasible. If we have to make some of those estimates more aggressive, then that's going to be a decision for the group. How comfortable are you that will materialize? And if it's we're putting an aggressive assumption into something that's not heavily weighted, then that's probably okay. If it's something that is really critical, it may change the risk tolerance that the board is willing to accept, or OSU for that matter. Yeah.
And one follow-up question, is that okay?
Please.
In light of the fact that Colin is not here today as our forest redirector, do you folks accept written comments up until what time, if you do?
We would accept your comments at any point. I think it's ongoing work here to further refine the inputs and the approaches going forward to address financial concerns and questions, as well as other topics. So the work is ongoing, and whether through Colin or through the council, we'd be happy to receive your input.
Thank you so much. I'll take that back to them.
Thanks much.
And Vice Chair, Colin we presented this last week or the week before that, and he's seen a little bit more detailed version of this earlier. So he should
And
be.
I know there's an outreach to him since he wasn't able to be here. Shannon and folks from the OSU team reached out to schedule a separate conversation directly with Colin, further brief him. Good. All right, Keith.
Okay, Eric, can I have you pop that back to the good news screen where you had the various?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's it. So, understanding that it's probably beneficial for us to be better than slightly positive in terms of revenue and program costs, because there's going to be the necessity of a rainy day fund of some sort that will have to be self-funded. So here's, being the excellent forester you are, here's where I'm going to ask you the tough question. What's that target acreage in intensive regen harvest that we need to shoot for? I mean, based on all of your expertise, assuming it's more than 222 and assuming that it's maybe 400, well, where do we need to go to build in that backstop that allows us in good years to fill the bank and to cover the lost revenue we have in bad years? So I guess that's a tough question. I sort of asked that the other day, but not quite the same way. So give me a figure in terms of regen harvest acres that we ought to shoot for based on a conservative model.
Great.
And
Thanks.
Eric, if I can follow on, just because I suspect there are or I know there are a range of familiarities with these topics. If you'd also maybe speak to the log sale values as well, which I think folks may not know what a reasonable sort of what's the current market, what's it
Sure.
historically been, what might be a relatively conservative or appropriate assumption there.
Sure, I can do that. So Keith, I would love to be able to give you that number. The part that we can't dial that in yet is because we don't have the budgets. That's really the big number that's outstanding. If the budget number is entered in, then we can rerun this and all of these values are going to change. So what I have up here is based on that early March run that was made, and these numbers are, I think that uses a $5.3 million budget. I don't think that included at the time the authority's budget. It did include a $500,000 per year contingency fund, so that was built into that original number. So when you look at that, and to Peter's question, so we have the log sales that we're showing here. We start at 675 and we go up to 850. And this is because the forest is predominantly Doug fir. Those are sort of the range of values that we are using for Douglas fir saw logs. And 675 is a long-term historic average log sale price. So if you go back, and I can, on another presentation, I've got that number tracked back for almost 20 years. You can see that that's sort of where that price was. The number is going up. We've had inflation. We had lumber prices go up to $1,000. We've seen log prices go over $900 or $1,000, but that's a sort of once every 25-year market. I don't, for me, that would be an aggressive assumption to assume that you're going to see prices like that. And so the more conservative approach is going to be these lower numbers, 675, 650. I think when Dan Newton provided his input, he suggested that we increase 675 by $100 to 775. So those are kind of in the range of long-term averages, fairly conservative, and hopefully that we would see a little bit better when they actually go to do log sales. So I'm sorry, Keith, I probably didn't give you the actual number you were.
Oh, I'm coming back with another question, so it's okay. So,
Go ahead,
I'm gonna,
Keith, and then I'll get Brett and Shannon.
yeah. And Eric, I totally get that. And that's, but I also want us to know, based on your good analysis and Mike's, and so I think the question I asked last time was, and this is the corollary, was where do we set that budget? Where's a safe place where, based on what you guys think is a predictable harvest level, and how do we fund it? So in that, I think, if I remember correctly, it was anywhere between what, 2.8 and 4, something like that. Isn't that the range of answers we got, Shannon? You might remember. So, and again, I'm going to ask the question. I don't need an answer today, but I think it's one that we all need to know, is if we're at a conservative budgetary value, and we're going to say 3.5 million or 4 million, and not a Cadillac, how many regen acres do we need to harvest every year? And that's, and I like the idea of 675. I think that's exactly what we need to hear. But then the question is, because based on that, on that budget, how many acres are we talking about, and are we there?
Yeah, I'll give you a little piece of, I've done lots of budgets, big budgets and little budgets over my career for different clients or employers. And, one of the conversations was, well, we don't want a Cadillac budget, or we don't want,
right.
And maybe half of whatever the Cadillac is what we want. And one thing I would sort of, hope everybody understands is, when you say that, from the advisory committee, rewind years ago, the goal was a world-class research focus. And that, I think, is what the directive was to do. When we say we want to reduce the budget arbitrarily without saying, I don't want to do these things, then that's the information that needs to be communicated, is what do you want to do with this, and what don't you want to do? Because I think that budget is saying this is a world-class research forest. And so what would probably be helpful to the OSU team is to know, what is it that you don't want to do? Because, if I use road construction projects, if I come up with a budget and I say it's going to cost $5 million to do this 20 projects, and the customer comes back and says, well, I only want to pay 2.8, you can't do all 20 of the projects. You have to do part of them. And so now it's part of the customer, or the board has to come back and prioritize what it is that you want to do. So something to think about. Unsolicited, but there's some more.
Thanks.
All
Yeah.
right. Thanks, Eric.
And know that the next topic on today's agenda is in fact budget scenarios, and I imagine Brett and Shannon may address that a little bit. And also, when we have the additional time together, I think we will have some of those trade-off conversations as well. So go ahead, Brett, and then Shannon.
Yeah, and Shannon, do you want to jump in? I mean,
Eric, maybe you can stop sharing, and then we'll see each other a little better.
Yeah, Shannon, do you want to jump in? Because I feel like you might have something to actually say in response to what you've heard or what Eric said so far, and I can hold, that helps.
Sure, if that works for you, Brett. I guess just one thing that I wanted to, well, actually two things that I wanted to follow up on. One, Keith, regarding your question, that looking at the range of values that seem feasible, given the projections that we're looking at, given the research design and the HCP commitments, but then also looking at the range of, conservative to moderate, what do we think will likely happen, and really focusing on what that conservative end looks like as well. is where we're heading and where we've been heading. I think it's really difficult to try and pinpoint an exact revenue that we need to hit. And in many ways, really that shifts the focus away from the research design. Because the projections and the budget and everything that we've been working on are based in implementing the research design that's written in the research proposal, and using the allocations and the constraints that this group and the advisory committee, developed over quite a long period of time. And so that's sort of the baseline of what we're working with, and looking for now with conversations, kind of in some cases looking with new eyes, like with the harvest cap, but really bringing it back to that foundation of the research design. And so that's what's driving a lot of these projections, in addition to the uneven age class distribution. So, Eric and Mike both talked about constraints in the model for when restoration thinnings happen, when regeneration harvest and intensive happen, and when extensive harvests happen. And so we have those numbers from the research design and further work in the management plan of when those things can happen. And then we have the reality on the ground of this really uneven age class distribution, this bimodal age class distribution, where there are periods of time when, according to those rules, or what's written into the research design, when a certain number of stands become eligible for the treatments that they've been assigned to. And so that's the other kind of main constraint that we're working with. And then the flip side, as both you and Eric noted, is the budget. And that's one thing that we're going to delve into a little bit more in detail. But all of this is ongoing work, both with this larger group of the board and the subgroup that we've been meeting with, and who have the spreadsheets behind this information to really dig into it more. So, that's still the focus going forward, is to continue to have these discussions and work towards ultimately what that range is that we think looks both viable and realistic.
Shannon, let me ask this then, as a prospective board member, and there's a bunch of us here, that at some point in the not too distant future, I think we all need to know what that situation looks like, right? In terms of acres, and in terms of budget, and in terms of delivering the research platform that we would all like to do. And so I hate to keep coming back to this, and I know it's way more complicated than I'm trying to make it. I'm not trying to negate any of that, but at some point, that's what I need to see, right? And I need to see that this is what it's going to cost us, and do we have the acres to get there, right? And I know that's all that this is about, but does that make sense? That because we keep saying, man, this is really complicated, it gets more complicated all the time, and God knows you know that way better than me. But on the other hand, at some point, as a prospective board member, I want two numbers. I want a research platform, and I want a harvest, and a projected revenue. I guess that's three numbers. So we can chew on that and go, man, we can, there we go. And then at least begin some operational belief that that's where we're going. And I'm not trying to monopolize this, but in the end, those numbers would be really good. Maybe just to satisfy my own curiosity.
Yep,
Sorry.
understood. And I mean, that's where we all need to get to, is
Right.
The numbers, the range of numbers that we think are feasible and realistic. And what we're working through right now are some things related to both the modeling that we can now do with the updated data, but also locking down some things in the HCP that impact what that analysis looks like. But I know that that's also a topic, digging further into both the budget scenarios and some of the trade-offs that Eric was talking about, as well as the approaches on this analysis, that's a big part of the conversations that I think are being planned with this group, including at the retreat next week.
Good, good. Okay. Thanks so much. And thanks for humoring me too.
Thanks, Keith, for the questions. I think it's helpful, and I suspect there are others that have similar questions, so I appreciate that. Brett? You're on mute.
There we go. Thanks. Yeah, and I think Keith, what Shannon and Eric are trying to, I mean, this context for this part of the presentation is what's happened since the last time the Prospective board met, and there was a subgroup meeting, and I think where Eric's like, don't think we're going to pin the tail on the donkey, and Shannon's suggesting a range. I think that's kind of where we're trying to, or where Shannon and Eric are trying to get the board's mind is, let's see numbers, but let's see them within a range, both on the revenue side and on the cost side, because certainty is elusive around all this. So my question though for Eric is, well, there are two. One's quick. I think the answer is yes, but Mike presented on MBG's work, and he said that their model work is not constrained by non-declining even flow, and I think your model is similar, right? You're not constraining it
It's
based
looking
on
at, it's looking at any period that you want to. Right now, we have it set up in decades. So we're taking the average volume per acre and the average acres over that decade and looking at what the annual result would be. But we can break that into any as fine as we want to. We can make it an annual. You could even use the same model to model individual harvest units. But right now it's using whatever you put in, and what we're putting in is an average 10-year acres and volume per acre.
Okay. And then the other question is, I noticed that when you called out what the board needs to think about is risk tolerance around model inputs. I noticed that yield or MAI wasn't part of those when I think you listed your bullets, and I'm curious, yeah, what did you use around yield for your model work, and just how do you think about it? Like how would you suggest the board think about it? Should they think about it as a range, or yeah, that's the question.
So that's a good question. In this, especially in the first 10-year period, and probably even in the second 10-year period, I'm really looking at what's on the ground right now. So that MAI and that yield is informing you on growth once you essentially plant that next tree and it grows to maturity. There's probably some indication of what it's going to do over the next 10, 20, 30 years. That I'm considering the merchantable 60, 80-year-old trees that are out there right now. And we're trying to wrap our head around what are those trees right now, and maybe some estimates of what will they be. And that's, part of this discussion around MAI is rewind to some of those original model runs, and it was saying that there were going to be 70 to the acre, 70,000 board feet per acre at final rotation or at regen. We aren't seeing that right now. So we're looking on this simple model of what's out there right now and what's likely to be realized. So that MAI is going to inform what you use for a volume per acre at harvest. And then we have a ability to adjust that. So we can say the model says 36. We want to reduce that by 20% because we want to be conservative. And then in our simple spreadsheet, it'll play out that way. Mike might have a better
I think he's ready for it.
answer on the MAI question.
Largely in agreement there, Eric, with Eric. I just wanted to offer that, like Eric's model, the first several decades of our model is, of course, really depends on what is currently the current inventory. That's a lot of activities happening out there for quite a number of years. And something to think about with MAI is just that, and we kind of got into this in the subgroup, is whether the future of management on the forest will be similar to the past. So thinking in terms of silviculture and the intensity of silviculture and the quality of planting, for example. So if the future is similar to the past, then maybe the lower MAI, the 500 scenario is most reflective of what will happen. If there will be more intensive silviculture, maybe that higher level, that the 2020 scenario might be more reflective of it. And also just maybe putting Eric's model in a little context too, about like the question, Brett, about non-declining yield. I think that's really a question at that strategic level about harvest level, so that very long-term model. And I think Eric hopefully would agree that Eric's going to put together a more tactical level model. So it has that kind of shorter period where you aren't necessarily using Eric's model to find harvest level. You might be using MB&G's work, which then feeds into Eric's, so you can really tailor the assumptions around actual prices, actual costs, actual acres available in Eric's work. I will note that in our work, we have log prices. We have I can tell you the average log prices that we're running with is around, it's around $450. Sorry, $750 per 1,000 board feet. And that's, it's a little bit lower in the first decade, but overall is about $750 through the life of the model. And as you think about log prices, I'll just offer that I think Eric's spreadsheet shows all prices that folks have seen before, but you're unlikely to see the very lowest prices for very long periods or the very highest prices for long periods, and they'll kind of fluctuate through the range of prices. So as you look ahead, there could be several years in a row with quite low log prices, but usually that's followed by higher log prices at some point. So when you're thinking about budgeting, it's not just thinking about average log price over a long time. It is thinking about there will be troughs and peaks in prices, and maybe that need for some level of float to get through periods, or there might not be that need. So it just depends there.
Thanks, Mike. Jennifer.
Yeah, hi guys. And this isn't really a question for you, Mike or Eric. It was just speaking as someone who's still trying to get up to speed and understand all the different overlays that we're working with here. I was just thinking at some point it would be helpful for me, and I don't know, Peter, if this is something at the retreat or elsewhere, but to also go over the research design framework, and just for me to better understand it and how that overlay intersects with all these discussions as well. So I'm sort of speaking as a relatively someone getting back up to speed on that, because it's in my mind it's still unclear, like what flexibility is there, where we're at with that. So I'm just sort of asking if that could maybe be something that we could also get knitted into this to help me orient, and then again sort of understand the intersections between these different things that we're looking at, recognizing they all fall within that the research forest framework, but that's a piece of it that I think would be key at some point to have a better understanding of.
Thanks, Jennifer. And yes, we can build that in. And in fact, sort of the very opening section and at least the draft of the agenda for the retreat included kind of revisiting the mission and some of the foundational principles and documents, because they are really what undergird the decision making. Well, one step, the advice you all are giving right now. So helpful reminder, and we'll make sure to build that into the agenda. Thanks. Mike.
A quick question for Mike and probably Eric too. So have you considered any possible tweaks to the models and all to take into account the possibility of changing climate too? I'm thinking maybe along the lines of growth. If we had warmer, drier years, potentially less growth, just something to consider out there too. Projecting out 100 years, 150 years is always a gamble. I mean, you can only really think about what might happen in the next 10 to 20 and be realistic about what's really going to occur. But just something to consider as you're modeling things too.
Also, we haven't made any specific changes in the model around that. I do think the MAI discussion is, maybe not directly, but is somewhat tied up. The climate change is a factor in that discussion. I think in other occasions, MBNG is considered the impacts of climate change there. I do think, like you said, looking out 100 years and what the effects will be is difficult. I think that also feeds through many of the assumptions within the model, and that's why I want to kind of be clear about what you can and can't get from the model we're offering. It's a decision support tool, but it's not going to be able to really dial in all the questions. And as you look out farther in the model, you should have less and less certainty over what will happen, of course, around yields, of course, around climate change, prices as well.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Mike and Mike. Any other comments or questions? All right. So on to budget scenarios and the approach there and status update. And I think we have Shannon and Brett on for this topic. Again, as a reminder to the group, we talked about 2 separate budgets last time and work to integrate those two to ensure that we aren't duplicating services and accounting for things in multiple unnecessary ways. So that work is ongoing. Gonna do a little bit of a status update from the team here on this. So I don't know, Shannon and Brett, who wants to take lead?
Shannon, are you good?
Sure, I can start off. Happy
Sure.
to. So the OSU and DSL teams have been continuing to work on the budget scenarios and working to address some of the things that we talked about in the last board meeting, where we right now have an agency budget for the authority, as well as an Elliott State Research Forest research operations budget. And there are some important differences between them, but also some areas of potential overlap that we've been working to identify and minimize, so that we can look at these budgets holistically. And so that's something that that Brett and I and the teams at OSU and DSL have been continuing to work on. I can give an update on the ESRF research operations budget side. And then Brett, if there's anything that you wanted to add to on the overall authority budget, that would be great too. And this is again, something that I think we're planning to talk about and dig into more at the retreat. Right. Okay. So hopefully everybody can see this. This is been relabeled as scenario 1. And this is the budget that we discussed at the March 10th meeting with more detail, as was requested to understand some of the breakdown behind some of these numbers. So this updated, more detailed version was shared with the prospective board members after the March 10th meeting. But I just wanted to start here as a reminder of what we discussed last time, and then we can continue building on it here at this meeting and at the conversation at the retreat. But this is the operations and research personnel categories. You can see here the areas that we identified and then had some initial discussions of how do these overlap potentially with some categories that are also included in the draft agency budget. The additional details here are a breakdown of salary and OPE. That was one of the requests that we had at the last meeting, as well as some more details on how some of these space and supplies calculations were done. So you'll see here operating expenses for research and management. Again, we have a $500,000 contingency fund that's built into this version, and that's something that Eric mentioned. 2 new lines here, or newer lines. that should be in the version that you received and are labeled as TBD is one for tribal engagement on research, monitoring, management, and other parts of the forest. And this was in response to some feedback that we got from members of this prospective board, as well as a separate cultural resources line for things like surveys. And so these lines are still TBD as far as expenses because they're dependent on further conversations that are happening both at a government to government level, as well as continuing to work with experts on cultural resource surveys. And that's something that we're engaged on right now. And so down here at the bottom, you'll see the total for this version of the budget at 5.5 million, and then some additional notes here on the bottom about some of the details that are going on to this spreadsheet. Okay, I'm going to find how to stop sharing the screen. And pull up another scenario. So we've had teams working on multiple scenarios and versions of this budget. This is a scenario 2. And again, I just want to make it clear that these are draft scenarios. These are not recommendations or final scenarios in any way. But this is looking at ways that we might be able to take the previous budget and look at areas that could be further slimmed down. And I want to note that we have had some members of this prospective board and other experts that we've been working with who have indicated that they also have some thoughts about areas that could be slimmed in these budgets. And so that's part of what we're working through right now through the financial subgroup, and then also through the retreat next week. We've also been continuing to ground truth these numbers and update them. And one of the points of feedback that we've gotten on the scenario 1 is that just given the scope of what's in the research design and the HCP commitments that we have, that is already a fairly lean budget. And so that's something that we're just keeping in mind as we're continuing to develop these other scenarios and budget alternatives. And so that's why, at least in this version, we have a forest engineer still. There was some discussion that we had at the last board meeting about this position maybe not needing to be captured here, but rather that the expenses could be captured in other parts of the budget. But in continuing to talk with several consulting foresters, the push, at least for where we are with this scenario and the scope of what's being planned for the Elliott, is that this is important to have captured in the budget still. And so that's why in this version, that's still here. You'll see the executive assistant is moved over basically to the agency budget side of things. And that agency budget also includes the executive director. And then the last version had a policy analyst and communications specialist position too. This version, so all the changes are in red. That's so that should help draw everyone's eye to where the changes have been made. And then anything that's grayed out is not included in the totals for each category at the bottom. So this version takes out an executive director from the research personnel side, but does assign a research lead or PI. And in this version, this is a 0.75 FTE position, which would have some implications about other responsibilities that this person would have if they're not fully funded and fully dedicated to the forest. But this is a way of reducing the FTE on this research lead sort of based on the other parts of the research staffing and scope that are being reduced in this version. So the other thing here is on the scenario 1, there were 3 full-time professorial research faculty. This version has 3 faculty members adjusted to summer salary only, which again has implications for where they're based and what their scope of research is, and focus on the Elliott. There are other scenarios that we've been looking at that still keeps a full-time research faculty on the forest, but could take it down to 1 person instead of 3, or anywhere in that range. So that's another area where we're looking at possible adjustments in order to look at what we can do with budget alternatives. You'll see here there's 3 research technicians instead of 4, and there's still a forestry technician. And these positions are pretty critical to carrying out the on-the-ground work with planning for harvest under the research design, as well as installation and maintenance of monitoring equipment and conducting the field work for the baseline research, the foundational research, as well as the HCP commitments. The other pieces here are graduate research assistants and student interns. And in this version of the budget, those positions are not directly funded by the Elliott. And there's a note here about how that may impact faculty engagement if they're not able to directly get funding for their students through this project, and may need to go find other sources of funding to support that work. So those are just part of the trade-off conversations. Down here on services and supplies, this number has been adjusted based on the number of full and part-time personnel up here. In the previous sections, the numbers of vehicles have been reduced, and the bottom line here is $4.55 million budget. So this is an example of one scenario, and we're continuing to work on other scenarios. And again, this is something that we'd really like to continue to engage members of this Prospective board on, looking at the commitments, the research design, and what we're looking at with a range of revenue projections, and then the alternate budget scenarios that we can develop together, as well as understanding what the trade-offs are with pulling different levers on the budget.
Thanks, Shannon. Let me pause there and see if there are questions or comments from the board, and then Brett will come to you, back to you. Bob, you came on camera. Was that to indicate you had a comment or a question?
No, it's just indicate that I finished lunch.
Okay, good. All right, Brett.
Okay, so I'll pick it up. I'll share my screen here as well. So what I'll speak to is the administrative agency budget side of things, and I'm going to try to do 2 things. One is to just build on what Shannon was saying about overall thoughts on adjustments, and then get into the last part of our agenda, our meeting agenda on this, which is a near-term bridge that's relevant to this legislative session. So okay. Will you all just let me know if can't see this spreadsheet, or if I need to do anything with it? Okay, thanks. Okay, so okay, so on this is the administrative agency budget that Gene Strait DSL investment, which is this I've highlighted in a peach row or peach column. I'll come back to that though, because just for context, when Gene did this, it's based on a look at other state administrative executive branch entities of similar size to what the Elliott State Forest Authority would be. And Gene's kind of trying to find the perfect unique animal, put this together. And again, it's draft for discussion purposes. So similar to our last meeting, I wanted to come back to this because the first basically up here in rows 7 through 10, these are the positions that would be parked within the new executive branch authority above and beyond what Shannon has presented from the research and operations end. And I highlighted a couple of these because when we come into the retreat, I think there are some remaining questions that we need to really dig into around, you know, in the OSU, or I should say the research and operations budget. There's a forester position, and then there's also a position above that labeled forester slash manager slash lead. And this question is out there around, you know, what we have or what DSL has in this budget is an agency director position. And I think we still need to work out with you all as a prospective board, the vision here is this executive director independent and a separate person from the lead that that OSU has in its budget around operations and research. Same with this public affairs. This is a communications position. And we talked last meeting a bit about the distinctions around communication needs and opportunities and distinct roles related to communications related to an executive branch agency, like the authority, and that includes within the legislative space, communicating with the legislature and others, but also in the public, the overall public space of what's happening with the Elliott, on the Elliott, and communicating with media in that context too, versus the communications in the research space, having some different needs around it. So whether consolidation can happen around these positions is really TBD on, you know, we want feedback and we want more input on this. The executive assistant position, like Shannon's presentation showed this as in this scenario, that the scenario with the red on it, she showed we've captured this as a duplicate. And when we come up with one merged budget, we feel like there can be one executive assistant for the overall authority as well as research and operations. Moving down into professional services, this line 4,300 in the annual budget, it's 5.5 million. This is something that mimics the OSU figure around professional services. And so I think Colin raised it at the last board meeting and we followed up by email, but just to clarify for you all, we don't need to double this 5.5 number. OSU's number on it is slightly higher for, I think, good reasons. We just didn't want it to get lost in the shuffle as we're comparing, you know, an administrative agency budget with a research and operations budget. We want to be sure it's reflected in both, but it is the same thing. And so when we come to a merged budget, we can combine those. Lease payments, this is something we have in both budgets. And it's an area where I think we could do some scaling down, because the idea is whether it's the executive director for the agency and related staff on the administrative agency end, or operations and research staff, the aim is to have folks housed together. And we shouldn't, you know, there may be some additional need on costs or for costs, because we're talking about potentially 4 additional bodies housed in one location along with the research and operations staffing side, but it may not be as high as the 63,000 a year that you see in this budget. So that I flag that as amongst the yellow highlights for potential scaling or reductions. And then same with services and supplies. So let me pause on that before I get into the next part of this administrative agency budget piece, or agenda piece, which is this legislative session in the first 6 months of the agency authority's life. So are there any questions on everything I've said so far? Okay, I'll keep moving. Okay, so in the peach column here, the 6-month total, what Gene did was break things down from, you can see in the final 3 columns of this draft discussion budget by 12-month annual total, and then a 6-month total now. And the reason the 6-month total exists is the way things are currently proposed, and even under the new extended timeline that Senate Bill 161 would advance, that doesn't change when the Elliott State Research Forest Authority and you all as current prospective board members, coming board members, the authority would still come into existence and invest on January 1, 2024. That is during, we need to be mindful of, okay, if that's going to happen and there's going to be a hiring of an executive director and related staff, and then, work beginning around the overall enterprise of the Elliott State Research Forest, there's got to be, what's the fuel in the tank to do that? And when do we make sure the fuel is going to be there? If we wait until the 2024 legislative session, that puts us out, decisions made then are related to a fiscal year that would not begin until July 1 of 2024. And so there's a bridge period of time between January 1, 2024 and June 30th, where we need to make sure there's gas in the tank. And or figuring that out is parked as a conversation with the legislature. It's definitely a conversation with OSU and all of you as partners too. But knowing that we're in the midst of a legislative session this year, DSL has been having conversations with the Legislative Fiscal Office around this, and there's a process that will, I think, become a little more clear maybe later this week. But and DSL is working on kind of preparing to lead into that process with some numbers and articulation that relates to a current policy option package that DSL has this session. But the idea would be to bring money into adjusting that policy option package to be sure there's bridge funding for this new authority, and have that conversation with the legislature this session, as well as the governor's office. Looking at the numbers, and don't get too attached to figures here. What DSL did was a rough cut at scaling back the current budget to just a 6-month time horizon for that bridge period. It comes out to a total of 3.2 million. I highlighted in blue the big one, which is the 6-month scaled professional services cost, which is taken from the OSU operations and research budget. The 2.7 million is obviously the big number in here, and I think some of the questions we need to think about related to potentially skinnying up or shrinking the overall cost of the 6-month budget is whether how much of that comes into this budget, and then what else in here potentially could get scaled back. And really, this is something that I guess I feel like is probably a good thing for the retreat, but probably a good thing to be thinking about in general, which is the notion of how do we sequence or phase the funding needs for the authority and the overall research and operations as well, where there's that period of time where the authority comes into existence and is getting off the ground, and what do we really need to create a base agency and set of base functional agency at that point. I mean, how many positions would need to be hired right out of the gate versus what do we sequence for a little later. And the same can be said around some of the other expenses. So that's a conversation that's why I say don't get too attached to the numbers here. We wanted to show you what a 6-month total would look like. And I think for purposes of right now, update you on there is an ongoing conversation with Ledge Fiscal Office and the governor's office related to this legislative session. What the process and the numbers look like is still TBD, but we have it in mind that we've got to have this conversation now if we want the agency to have some wherewithal come January 1, 2024. And then I think introduce this notion of phasing or scaling, because the next step in a budget conversation with the legislature would be in that 2024 legislative session. And that would be for funding that would begin, on July 1, 2024. And then beyond that, it's, biennia for biennia out. I think the reality probably looks different around how mature the authority is, how mature work and operations research is on the forest, and what we're really going to need. It's probably I don't know if it's that kind of thing, but the notion of whether all the money's needed at once or how we scale it is, I think, a relevant thing to think about. And in DSL's context, we're DSL, we're the short timers here in theory. Once the authority exists, our role as an agency is to make sure the transitions are happening, including the HCP and wherewithal around budgets. And Vicki, I don't know if there's anything you want to add, but I'll stop there, and I think that about covers it.
No, you did a great job, Brett, and I appreciate what Shannon reflected in her remarks too. It's exactly what Eric Farm was saying. The board is going to have to make adjustments based on the finances in terms of what you have the ability to do. It's what we all do in our regular day-to-day budgeting and in our home place and our workplace. So we're going to just, it's a continuing discussion. I know tomorrow afternoon, all the agency directors are going to be instructed about what to do if they have additions to their budgets. So I'll learn a little bit more tomorrow. I got a sneak peek last week, but there's a lot of demands on the state budget right now. The governor has her priorities, and rightly so. We're going to be getting in line for some things, and we're also going to have to scale back some requests. But I don't think it's insurmountable. I just think we're going to be going through an adjustment, a constant adjustment as to what money is available and what we're going to be able to do right out of the gate. But I always assumed that. I never assumed we'd have that world-class research forest from the day we turn over the operations to the board authority. It's something that we aspire to, and we'll have as best of a forest as we can when we get out of the gate. But that's what this larger discussion has been about today. So you did a good job with that, Brett. Thank you.
Thanks, Vicki.
Comments or questions from the board or others on the staff? All right. Teresa, did you have something?
Yeah, so if we have feedback about, the positions and what they're for, what's needed, what's not needed, are you saying that is all going to happen at the retreat?
There will be an oops, sorry. Not sure why we're getting feedback here, but there'll be definitely conversations at the retreat. If you have questions or things you want to raise now, it's not premature to do so right now too.
Yeah, I didn't say that to put the cinch on any conversation now. I'd say give it to us if you've got it. I think the more we go into the retreat with, the better in terms of feedback.
Okay, I'll rattle off a couple things, and it's fine if we don't really have the time or whatever to talk about it today. One thing on the research budget that Shannon presented, just a thought on the research technicians. It looked like they were going to be OSU faculty positions, but it also had in parentheses like potentially a tribal partner. I have had discussions with people who live and work in Coos Bay, really hoping that positions that work on the research will be available to locals. And so I just wanted to kind of give that overall feedback as you're thinking about and creating a budget on positions. The other thing, let's see. So are you saying the executive director position you had on yours, Brett, is potentially good? We can talk about if that's needed separately from what Shannon was having on her sheet as like the research lead.
Yeah, I mean, more or less.
Okay.
Question is, every state agency has an executive director, and so our assumption from DSL is there needs to be an executive director of this agency or a director. Whether that director does all of the kinds of things that a natural resource executive branch agency's executive director does now, plus is the lead on the operations and the research for the forest, or is something above and beyond. I think that's part of what the question is. And at the last board meeting, I think some folks on the Prospective board have a belief that the person needs to be a forester with operational experience and so on and so forth. And then can we find in one, same question as last board meeting, can we find in one person somebody, if that's one of the things, the attributes that the board really wants, is that also somebody who can do the things that an executive branch agency director does in working with the legislature, other agencies in the state family, budgets, so on and so forth.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's probably a discussion we can have more at the retreat. I think my thoughts on it are that just thinking about what you presented, what Shannon presented, that having an executive director separate from the research lead and an executive assistant seems to me kind of redundant, that maybe more of the natural resources side could go into one of those positions and then the other administrative stuff into another position. But that's just kind of an offhand thought I had as you were presenting. And then just a general question. So the things that you presented, Brett, separate from Shannon's, those are costs that are going to be under the agency?
Yeah.
Okay.
In theory, though, all of the costs are under the new authority, right? Because the authority would be contracting with OSU on the operations, the research, and the operational management.
Mm-hmm.
So eventually, we've got to come together and merge.
Yeah.
The agency, speaking of the agency, DSL is only going to be responsible for the first 6 months.
Yeah,
Okay.
and so I think thinking about it as a package.
Yeah.
Ultimately, yeah.
Thank you.
Sorry, another question, comment, suggestion?
Yeah, just one more question, and I think this is probably going to be opening a can of worms, so I apologize ahead of time. I had remembered way back when people were talking about how this was going to work, a discussion about revenue from the forest was going to be used to fund the forest, like general baseline operations and not the research. And we haven't really talked about that since. I just think maybe that's something that I want to get clear on.
So maybe I'll have Shannon, if you want to speak to that. I also, so if you want to speak to that as well as, yeah, the local employment piece. And then I also thought it might be helpful for folks to get a little bit of a sense of, from the OSU perspective, what that research lead position sort of roles and responsibilities that person is covering from the research side would be helpful. So if you can touch on all three of those, that'd be helpful.
Sure. Yeah, so Teresa, I think your question gets at something that Jennifer also brought up about the conversation about the mission and vision for the forest, and then the board. So which it sounds like we're going to talk about more, or the board will talk about more at the retreat next week. But the vision and the planning for the forest and the research design as a whole, the operations, and then the budgeting, you're right that it's meant to support the foundational research operations of the forest, but the research is the operations. And so as all that planning has been going into the budget, it's looking at what is the research design that's laid out in the research proposal. That's the sort of backbone of the forest. So the triad, experimental design, the other experiments, the riparian restoration experiment, the marbled murrelet experiment, restoration thinnings in the conservation research watersheds. Those are all part of that backbone, as well as the monitoring that is described for basically across the entire network of the forest. So that's what the budget is meant to support, is the people, the equipment, the operational expenses to conduct that research and keep the forest running. And then anything layered on top of that, as far as other research, that's where other groups, other researchers would need to bring in additional funding to support their work.
Yeah, I think there's some impression that the OSU, the budget on the operations and research side is like all the bells and whistles and the Cadillac and yada yada. And I think, Shannon, that's what I've heard separately, is like, no, that's not, you're still talking about the base for operations and research, right?
Yes, yep, we are, with additional funding, for example, through grants being able to be layered in on top of that, and all of the revenue generated off of the forest going back into the forest to support that same research program and all the operations associated with it. Peter, I'm trying to remember the other two things that you, one was local community.
Yeah, that, and then I wondered if you wanted to touch briefly on sort of the research lead position and the roles and responsibilities OSU is envisioning as important that are captured there.
Yeah. So, and this was something that I jotted down with your first question, Teresa, because it's a really critical part of the vision for the research forest is local community involvement and local employment. And so the line that you pointed out on the ESRF research operations budget is for research technician, and it says faculty research assistant in parentheses next to it. That's not a faculty position. It's just sort of the category for how OSU terms those types of positions, but it would be a research tech. And with the structure that we have, this would be an OSU employee, or, a formal sort of agreement set up so that person is under the structure of the ESRF operations. That doesn't mean it's a current OSU employee. The idea is that there would be a search for that person, and having the ability for local community members, for tribal members, for anyone to be in those positions who would be able to contribute as a research assistant would be the goal. So that's something really critical in thinking about the planning and how all of these different components are coming together, is really being cognizant of how those positions are structured. And that is the overall vision, that there's thought put into who is able to be in those positions, and that it's not current OSU people. It is really, someone who is there in the local community. So thanks for that question, because that's really important to keep our eyes on.
Okay, thank you.
And then research lead. So that line, and this is an ongoing conversation, I think, as Brett noted, but with the public agency and the need to have an agency head or an agency lead in a specific role related to the authority and the public agency administration, that research PI position is really someone who has a research and active and forest management background, who can sort of manage the scope and breadth of the research and the day-to-day activities of the forest. And so that involves working with faculty, students, research and operations personnel, partners on the forest, as well as with the members of the authority staff, including the executive director. So that's one way of looking at it, where that the agency head has their own set of responsibilities and is closely connected. But this person, the agency head, wouldn't necessarily need to have that wealth of research experience. Their focus may be elsewhere from what we've heard. And so that's where that research lead PI comes in, as being that critical person on the research forest, modeled after other research forests like the H.J. Andrews and the Olympic Experimental State Forest.
Thanks. Other comments or questions from the board?
Peter,
Yeah, Tom.
I'll just say that also with the scientists, I mean, those, it would be great if we had people from the region that ended up being PhD scientists that wanted to return to Southwestern Oregon. Caitlin Riley comes to mind as a Reedsport high school grad, and someone that's doing a grad degree here now, and who knows if she'll go on and do her PhD. But the point being that those, any opportunity to have local positions filled, have those positions filled by local people who love the area, know the area, understand the history, and the we are of course open and would welcome that readily. Just funny and interesting thinking about the PhD scientist is something separate, but it certainly could fall into that category.
Thanks, Tom. And I saw Keith smiling as well. So I think, Teresa, you're striking a chord there. I know it would for Melissa and others as well. So thanks for raising it. Why don't we take a break and take 15 minutes from your clock of reference. So, 2:12-ish, thereabouts, 10 after 2. Let's plan on returning and next agenda topics. Great, thanks. All right, next agenda topic really is to kind of give an update and some of it an overview of some of the additional work streams and areas that folks are focused on, specifically looking at the habitat conservation plan and those efforts. We've talked a little bit about the legislation and timelines, so we'll touch briefly on that, and then Shutter Creek. Brett, I think wondering if you might want to just go ahead and talk about the first, at least maybe the legislation, anything about that. We'll take that one off the list, and maybe even Shutter Creek. And then we'll have a little bit more time for the HCP topic.
Yeah, you're reading my mind. Okay, thanks, Peter. I'll start with Shutter Creek. Well, yeah, I'll do it in this order because, you know, nobody really wants to talk about HCPs or muralets, right? So I'll start with Shutter Creek and then go into Senate Bill 161 and I pause a little bit on that, and then, but I think that tees up actually the final point around the HCP a little better. So on Shutter Creek, I guess just for quick background context, Shutter Creek, the former prison facility on the south coast near Reedsport, you know, it's the, as you all I think know, it's the envisioned place where if all goes well and next steps continue to happen and funding falls into place beyond what DSL's already landed, Shutter Creek would be the spot where the Research Forest Authority and related staff would be housed, and where there would be space for researchers, students, and then partnerships, including with the Confederate Tribes of the Coos, Lower Umpqua and Siuslaw tribe, as well as other partners. Right now, it's a former prison facility that is going to need a lot of work to get to the next step in the vision. And I think on updates here since our last meeting, I'm pretty sure this is all news. So since our last meeting, DSL, based on Director Walker's signature of the GSA, General Services Administration letter, we're moving forward with the deed transfer of Shutter Creek to DSL, and effectively that would put the site and the facility under state management through DSL instead of state management through Department of Corrections. And the key deed language changes would be, you know, instead of it will remain a federal property, federal public benefit property, but instead of the public use being a correctional facility, the new deeded public use for the site would be wildlife conservation, which is to say that any future use of that site needs to be consistent with wildlife conservation. And a few things related to that. I mean, one is there's a cell tower up on that site that I know is of critical importance to emergency communications for the South Coast and perhaps beyond. And so state police, the county, the sheriff's department, they all have a pretty keen interest in it. I'd say the state as a whole has a pretty keen interest in it for that reason. And it's also a Verizon tower. So there's interest there. That tower is a pre-existing facility structure and use. So we don't envision that changing. It would be part of the future of the site to have a fully functional communications cell tower. On the future of having buildings there associated with the research forest, that's something that is consistent with the new public benefit use, because the use of the site related to the Elliott State Research Forest and Authority is tied directly to wildlife and conservation and forest management being part of that. When we get into what to do with the rest of the buildings on the site, this is part of the kind of ongoing conversation that's going to need a lot of planning work. And so while we're moving forward, I think sometime later this month, DSL expects to have papers from the federal government related to the deed transfer, and attorneys will certainly be talking about all this. In the meantime, we're working out an agreement between Department of Corrections and Department of State Lands related to how we meaning DSL, handle the existing agreements and contracts that exist tied to the site. So that includes with the city of Lakeside related to water and sewer, and for security detailing, and then for maintenance of the site in the meantime, as well as costs. Department of Corrections has shouldered all of the costs related to Shutter Creek since it was closed as a prison facility roughly 2 years ago. And so at this point in time, DSL would be taking over the costs and liabilities, which is a big deal. And we have the federal Housing and Urban Development community block grant. That grant is $4 million, and I think since our last meeting, we've received updates on not just updates, but we've got a grant award letter as well as a proposed grant agreement. And we at DSL are going to get back to the federal government through HUD around a budget and project narrative. The good thing is there are soft costs, and that relates to things like security and maintenance, and a development process, a planning process. And then there are the hard costs, which relate to anything related to turning dirt, either demolishing or redeveloping buildings. We need to get environmental compliance and review done before we turn any dirt, but related to the soft costs of a process around development and visioning, as well as paying for the ongoing security and maintenance on the site, we can use that grant to get reimbursed for those costs. So that's a bit of the update on Shutter Creek. I think the main thing to flag is there's of the 80 or so acres on the site, not all are going to be relevant to use for the Elliott State Research Forest Authority. And in the context of the new public benefit use of wildlife conservation, there's a planning process that needs to happen around the rest of the site, the buildings, hard structures, existing green spaces. Part of the site is designated as, this will bring us full circle, as murrelet habitat by Department of Corrections. When the state uplisted murrelets from threatened to endangered, Department of Corrections flagged the portion of the site that was rated to have habitat. So that process is something that is to come. And I think related to this on the near horizon, on the 20th of this month, DSL and the Confederated Tribes of the Coos-Lorumquah and Sayusla Indians are going to be, we will go out with the tribe to the site on the 20th. And I think this is a follow-up on the government consultation that happened in late March. So between DSL and the tribe, we'll be talking about the site and the vision on that day. I wanted to also put out, I'll be back in Oregon for the retreat, and on the 19th, I'll be down on the South Coast, I should say. And I don't plan to go anywhere after the retreat other than down on the South Coast. So if anybody on the Prospective board wants to visit the site on the 19th, just let me know. Department of Corrections has maintenance staffing that's there, and he's been great, just really accommodating on access. So I'll stop on Shutter Creek. I think Bill, Vicky, please fill in if I've missed anything, or anybody else.
Hey,
Right.
Brett,
Yeah, Jack.
could you, I was just looking through my notes. Did you ever send a kind of a site map of the Shutter Creek area that just gives a kind of a layout of the buildings, roads, communications type things? Is something like that available just to kind of get a little bit better feel for what it looks like?
Yeah. I'll be sure I send that through Peter and Jen at Oregon Consensus. Yep. And we have Department of Corrections has been great. We have, if you really want to dive into the details on the buildings, including their current maintenance level and condition, let me know. I have spreadsheets.
Thanks, Jack. Thanks, Brett. Any other questions or comments?
Other than when I retire, I'm gonna have nightmares about spreadsheets. They're just the bane of my existence, but thank you.
I suspect you're not alone. Some people dream of them though, and they're not nightmares. So, all right, Brett, onward.
Okay, so Senate Bill 161, this relates to the timeline for not just the HCP, but the FMP going to the State Land Board. Terminations around financial viability, OSU Board of Trustees voting on engagement in the state research forest. So the timeline shift that Senate Bill, just for a refresher, 161 would make is shifting the timeline for the state to hand over the HCP to the federal services for final processing through a final environmental impact statement to November 1. And the other tying off points with the state land board around the FMP, with the Board of Trustees at Oregon State University, all of those to-dos, action items, there are conditions that have to happen in order for the authority to actually become an authority and for the research forest to become an actual state recognized research forest. Those things would all be shifted to a deadline of November 1 instead of July 1. So that bill would do that cleanup or that timeline shifting. And I think, like Vicki mentioned earlier, it's on the Senate floor for a third reading today. And so our expectation is it'll pass out of the Senate side and move over to the House of Representatives side of the legislature in this legislative session. And yeah, I think, we had a lot of conversation last meeting about the timeline and adequacy. And, at the Senate hearing, there were concerns advanced. You all, thank you to everybody who signed on to the letter, but you all weighed in as prospective board members on the letter supporting Senate Bill 161. I know Tom was not on that letter from OSU, and OSU at the Senate hearing on the committee side indicated a desire for more time. And so those are things that are part of the current status of 161. All of this, I say it in advance of the conversation that we're about to have on the HCP, because where we go in resolving issues related to muralettes and revising the harvest cap and updating data relevant to accuracy of the HCP or in the take analysis, all of that's parked within the context of needing and having asked for more time to do it through this Senate bill.
Additional comments or questions there? Paul or Tom, see you there. Okay. All right, so stay tuned on that. We'll keep you updated as things progress. And conversations continue. And then finally moving on to the topic of the HCP, Shannon and Brett, for both of you, and specifically looking at two issues that arose during the federal process. One related to marble murrelet buffering, and the other related to a harvest cap on the forest. So a team of folks has been working hard to figure out how to address that and the associated ripple effects and complications in trying to do so. So a bit of an update on that work. And again, here too, eye towards giving you all visibility into the conversations and potential approaches to addressing things, and knowing that next week we'll have more time together to dig into this and get additional guidance from you. So with that as context, I think Brett, maybe you're kicking us off, and then Shannon filling in.
Yep. Thanks. I'm sorry for the shifting. I plugged in my computer. It's good. I won't lose y'all. So I think maybe, thanks Peter for teeing up. There's maybe we pull it back to a high level. I mean, there's a lot that remains to be done related to the Elliott State Research Force and getting it set up. And that includes stuff that's parked on the social end and related to recreation and education. And back to the HCP part of this is DSL's operating under the direction that as the applicant for the HCP, we're moving forward based on direction from the state, both legislation and the state land board, and fundamentally getting the incidental take permits that an HCP process yields is fundamental to the notion of having an operable forest, and also related to costs of management. Operating under take avoidance versus incidental take permits and programmatic HCP coverage are two very different things. So the interest is certainly front and center, and the timeline puts things, right on the windshield with the issues that have come up. And so I think, to be clear, we are proposing to revise the harvest cap that's in the current HCP, and the motivation around that, we can get into it more based on any questions, but it's really to enable the research design, both around the extensive and the intensive approach in the research design to be able to happen. There were some issues around how the harvest cap current language is written, that if not changed would really constrain things. We are looking to pull out things that OSU in Appendix 11 of its research design had flagged around the current occupied layer for marble murrelets contains areas of the forest that have been clear cut since roughly 2008, but that didn't show up in the previous LiDAR data. And so with the new LiDAR data, there's an opportunity to correct that and pull acres out that aren't occupied, and make sure they're not entangled in the occupied layer. And then there's Peter, what you alluded to, the issue of murrelet habitat buffering, and that has come up not just through public comments, but through the Fish and Wildlife Services feedback on the proposed HCP, the one that went out at the end of last year. I think before we dive into that, and I hand it over to Shannon and the OSU team, I mean, I want to, I guess, convey a sense to the full Prospective board of, this HCP is not about single species management, although one species is getting a lot of attention right now. We're also working on the aquatic side and making progress with National Marine Fisheries Service on their remaining issues. So it's important to have the additional time to tie those things off, but I think good progress there. And on the murrelet side, or the terrestrial side, the context is looking at how we problem solve and get to resolution of the murrelet issue, but doing so in a context of, you know, keeping three fundamental pillars in the ground. And, you know, one is having a financially viable forest, like whatever the solution is on the murrelet issue. We need to make sure that the forest remains financially viable. And there are, as you all know, ongoing live relevant conversations related to how to make sure viability happens. We feel like the conversation space around murrelets is relevant to that. I mean, both to some it smells like risk, and I mean, I think there are actually some opportunities in that space. But the other pillar is the research design and how to come out of the problem solving with still having a viable research design. And then the third is the kind of the conservation outcomes for the forest, and making sure, I mean, part of the murrelet conversation is how do we problem solve without upsetting the apple cart for other species on the forest. So it's a challenging place. Last meeting, part of what came from my update was, you know, we were considering certain approaches, and we still are, around how to problem solve this, including, you know, buffering and specific limited portions of the management research watershed, as well as using kind of temporal analyses to right size what the effects, the take analysis would be. I think the thing that we really want to get into here, though, is since our last meeting, OSU's come out with a variety of really, well, it's a specific thing, not a variety, but there's been a lot of work that went into it. And I think compliments to the OSU team for doing it. They, you know, in the context of what we'd been hearing from the services and what came up in the comments related to no buffers, I think one easy prescriptive regulatory approach is, well, put buffers on in some areas, maybe not, you know, as much as everybody would want, and still a compromise context, but just put buffers on in certain areas. And that's kind of the prescriptive approach. But I think there's been an interest amongst a lot of folks, and I'll let folks on this Prospective board speak for themselves, but an interest in a more creative solution that gets at how do you reduce risks to future fragmentation? How do you allow for a future forest that is one of connected habitat, not fragmented habitat? And how do you keep the ship financially viable? And OSU developed a new, based on the new LiDAR data, and I won't go too far here because it's really, I think, I want to hand this over to OSU, but a new consolidated layer based on updated LiDAR data that I think does a lot better job capturing contiguous older forest on the Elliott, where, you know, what might be suitable for murrelets, as well as taking out what isn't suitable habitat and addressing some of the stringers or fragments. And it was all done in the context of how do we make sure that the analysis for the HCP of effects or Endangered Species Act take is happening based on the best information that we have. But I think we're still in a problem solving mode around what the research design is going to look like. And we need, you know, we're proposing to revise the harvest cap and do some other things on the aquatic side. So there's no question we're revising the HCP, and that'll happen based on the process we have in place. How we use the new consolidated layer in that context of changes to the HCP, not just take analysis under the Endangered Species Act, that's the conversation that is happening. And we had a subgroup meeting last week to dive into this. And I think based on, well, I think, I mean, it was a good discussion, but not a final discussion. DSL and OSU have worked up some slides we're going to show coming out of that. But I think for me, the handoff point is we want to bring this into the retreat with the intention of tying off a path forward as best we can. And DSL needs to do that. And, you know, as the applicant, we've got to hit a timeline although extended, it's still pressing. So getting feedback from you all around that is really relevant. And with that, I think I'll hand it over to you, Shannon. I don't know who you want to hand it, if anybody, if you want to hand it to on the slides, but I'll pass the baton.
Okay. Thanks, Brett. Let me go ahead and. Okay, is everybody seeing that in the right view?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm just going to go ahead and give an overview of a couple of slides looking at maps and just wanted to give on these maps and the analysis in particular a lot of credit to Deanne Carlson at OSU and Jen Guerrero, who have done a lot of work with taking information from the update to the Betz-Yang model from 2023 and thinking about how this relates to conversations that have been happening around the HCP that DSL and the services have been having. So this is a draft map and a draft document, but we wanted to share a couple of different maps and talk about the modeling and occupied data that went into the research proposal, the 2020 research proposal, and then also the current version of the HCP. And then also talk about this March 2023 consolidated habitat layer and what it was developed for, and kind of take the conversation from there, as Brett was saying. So this is a draft of the March 2023, what we're calling the consolidated Murrelet habitat layer. This is one of the things that we discussed with the subgroup of this Prospective board last week, and that's, as Brett said, an ongoing conversation. But basically, this layer here, you can see it in the hashed marks, is based on a translation of the 2023 Betz-Yang model. So that model used occupied data from ODF and Kim Nelson, as well as the LiDAR that was available at the time, which was 2008 LiDAR, to create a habitat suitability model for the Elliott. And that's what has been used as modeled potential habitat in addition to the occupied data that the HCP uses. This updated consolidated layer uses the 2021 LiDAR that we have available. And this model also removes some acres that were in the occupied habitat layer that were still being identified as occupied, about 1,400 acres that are now young forest. They, in between the 2008 LiDAR when that was taken and now they had regeneration harvest done on those stands. And so it corrects for that, which was, as Brett said, something that was pointed out as something needed to be addressed in the research proposal. And then it also uses the 2021 LiDAR instead of the 2008 LiDAR. So underneath here, this map, this is a 30-meter raster grid, and then the stand polygons have been used in combination with that model data for planning purposes. A couple of other things to note, areas of high probability habitat identified by the model or bisected by narrow areas identified as low probability habitat were all consolidated as habitat. And then what we're calling stringers or small areas or patches of stands of older trees identified by the model as mid to high probability habitat that have very little interior habitat to them were not included in this layer. So this layer was developed specifically to address a need that was identified by the services and by DSL for a take analysis. And so that as we're talking through the discussion points with everybody, just wanted to make that clear and ask everyone to keep that in mind, as that is what this layer specifically was developed for. I guess I'll ask Deanne or Jen if there are other points that you would want to make on this slide and this map before I turn to the other one.
No, I'm good. I think you covered it quite well. No.
Okay. Okay, so that's the 2023 consolidated habitat layer. This is the 2020 Betsy model. So this is just the model data. It's not the Kim Nelson and ODF occupied data laid on top of that, but you can see the difference in what is being covered by this 2020 model versus the 2023 model. And so this is a habitat suitability index based off of the occupied data, but this map does not include that occupied data. And you can see the difference here when using the 2008 LiDAR versus the 2021 LiDAR canopy height data. So I'll just flip back and forth again real quick. This is the 2023, and that's the 2020.
So Shannon, the first one, the 2023 right here, that is occupied or available?
No, this is not occupied. So this is modeled as potential habitat as high suitability habitat using tree height and LiDAR data. So this is not picking up that all of these areas are occupied. The occupied data that's in the HCP are based on surveys that noted presence, and those were done by ODF and Kim Nelson and others at another point in time.
Just to clarify, some of these may be occupied or, but it's a broader landscapes scale look at this.
Yeah, thanks for that clarification, Jen. So the occupied data isn't shown here, but it overlays. So this is the full consolidated layer that includes not just the occupied, but also the modeled habitat. That doesn't mean that surveys found murrelet presence across this full layer.
And what's the height requirement for this information?
So it's part of the model. For the most part, it picks up on the older trees and the older stands. There's not necessarily a height. It's just a combination of factors going into the model of what would be considered high value habitat based on known high value habitat from occupied sites on the forest.
Thank you.
And then one more map. This third slide is really a combination of the first two. So you can see in kind of the salmon's color, the Betsy 2020 model, and then the 2023 consolidated murrelet layer covers that area plus the blue that you see here captured in other areas. So just look at a comparison. And then,
Comments or questions from the group? Yeah, I'll go ahead. Shannon, do you have something else? Apologize.
no, I was going to ask the same thing.
All
And
right.
also look to Brett to see if there was anything else you wanted to cover with those two slides.
Those are good, high level. I mean, that's there's a tremendous amount of work that goes into it. And I think you can kind of see when we're talking to the services about effects of different management types in the either intensive or extensive, the effects as they translate to take under the Endangered Species Act is obviously relevant to like where are the birds? We don't know where all the birds are, so I think the best we can do is indicate where the most suitable habitat is. And I think where we go, the point that we're getting into next here is, given the the use of the new LiDAR data gets us a lot finer, better view of what the habitat looks like on the forest. How do we use that in outside of just analysis of effects, but in the context of potential HCP changes? So that's where we're going next, and I think this next set of slides will prompt some feedback.
Okay. So these are a set of slides with a bunch of different discussion points to kind of make the connection between the conversation that Brett was talking about with the services and what that 2023 consolidated layer was developed for, which was really to get at some questions around the take analysis based on the current data that we have in the research design and looking at edge effects. And now this is making the connection to what Brett was talking about with other considerations in the HCP. So discussion point 1 is around proceeding with allocation treatments and accept associated ESA take based on that take analysis. Involve revising the draft HCP to enable this by removing the 1,400 acres of recent clear cuts from occupied habitat, which the current, there's a description of that in the 2020 research proposal, and there's also a description in the current HCP about doing that. And then, as Brett said, adjusting harvest cap language. And so some potential impacts, maintaining descriptions in the research proposal and the 2022 HCP public draft, as well as addressing the description of how to resolve known errors in the data, the 1,400 acres of young forest in the occupied layer. It does not have an appreciable impact on the current financial projections and the range of scenarios that we talked about before the break. Allows for extensive harvest to occur in older forests, as is described in the research design, outside of the capped condition that's in the HCP, or taking that into consideration. But then uncertainty about meeting issuance criteria for an incidental take permit, which would be dependent on that take analysis. Okay, we'll move on to the next one. If mitigation measures are not sufficient to offset ESA take on the forest based on the take analysis, then we're also looking at these other discussion points. And so a second discussion point is applying 150-foot buffers to select portions of ODF occupied sites in the management research watersheds. Potential impacts that we're seeing here collectively for the group that's looking at this is this may meet ITP issuance criteria dependent on the take analysis. It increases protection from edge habitat impacts in some of the occupied stands, and we can talk more about that if there are specific questions. Allows for more extensive harvest experimentation in older forests relative to some of the other decision points we'll talk about. There is a direct impact to about approximately 1,000 acres of intensive and extensive management. And I believe what is being discussed is that intensive would have a no-cut buffer. Extensive could potentially have certain restrictions on retention levels within the buffer area, but not necessarily be no touch. Brett, do you have anything you want to add to that first column before I go into the remaining bullet points?
No, I think, yeah, let's just keep rolling.
Okay.
Thanks, though.
On this side, limit operations on additional acres. So looking at the impacts not just directly on the acres that would be included in a buffer area, but looking at other considerations. For example, there could potentially be restrictions on the use of roads if they are within the buffer, which would impact treatments on other surrounding stands, or operational constraints for layout and adjacent stands. So those are a couple of examples. Another piece, because the design for the Elliott is integrated across aquatic, riparian, terrestrial areas, is buffers could potentially limit options for other species. For example, planned restoration management activities for aquatic species. And so this is an area where talking with people who are involved in the aquatic side of the HCP, as well as the planned research, is really important, because there are these areas are all connected and the research is all connected. Impacts the financial viability of the forest through the direct impacts, and then also any potential limitations on operations in other areas. And then impacts on the research design of especially replication of the triad treatments and landscape level research. So if you remember from the research proposal, at the subwatershed scale, depending on what type of assignment it received, either an extensive triad E, triad I, or reserve with intensive, there is a balance within each subwatershed for the percentage of acres. And so if you're buffering some of those acres, then that impacts the balance at the subwatershed scale. And then I should note on the first slide as well, and the upcoming ones, there's a bullet point here for others, because this really is meant to be a discussion about ideas that are coming up through the HCP conversations that DSL and the services and others are having, and that OSU is part of. But really, this is an area for brainstorming what the full range of impacts of any one of these discussion points could be. Let me just connect this back real quick. So applying 150-foot buffers to select portions of the occupied sites in the MRW. This is an example of that. Might be a little tough to see, but in the white here, this is a map from ICF that has a 150-foot buffer on it.
Yeah, and it's hard to see without zooming in, but I think that's part of the point here is that 150-foot buffer option doesn't apply to every occupied site in the MRW. It's just certain select ones that are based on trying to get the most focused gain in protecting against edge effect to occupied trimas. But yeah, I think we did hear some feedback around all of these, and I'll touch on that in a little bit. But yeah, thanks, Shannon. Let's roll on.
Okay. Discussion point 3 is around that 2023 consolidated layer that was developed for a take analysis and analysis of edge effects. And this discussion point involves placing part or all of the consolidated habitat layer into a reserve or a high retention extensive allocation. Potential impacts that have been identified are this may meet ITP issuance criteria, again, dependent on the take analysis. Protects habitat of high suitability or value to murrelets from direct impacts and edge effects, including by maintaining functional buffers. Again, potentially limits options for other species, with an example on the aquatic side. Impacts to the research design as well, by limiting extensive harvest to high retention at 80% in more area of older forest than what is currently in the HCP. And the HCP has a condition of a 1,400 acre cap that's related to the marble murrelet experiment in occupied stands specifically. And the area where we're seeing in particular an impact when you run an analysis at the subwatershed scale is that the Triad E subwatersheds have more significant areas that would be affected by this approach compared to the Triad I or extensive subwatersheds. And then related to this, impacts to financials, but uncertainty as to the extent of what that impact would be, depending on how this might be applied. And so this is another view of that same 2023 consolidated murrelet habitat layer with the model underneath that we looked at. And related to that point, this is a table that shows on the left column, or I should say the middle column, current HCP layers and a comparison of murrelet take analysis and initial numbers. So this current HCP layers, meaning the ODF Trima, Kim Nelson, and 2020 Betsyang modeled potential habitat, and these are all acres. And in this column on the right, this is the 2023 consolidated layer, again, all in acres. So if we're looking at areas of intensive within the murrelet designation, this is where that area comes up. The approximately 1,400 acres that has had a harvest since the 2008, since it came into the layer as occupied. And that issue is resolved with the consolidated murrelet layer. Extensive within murrelet designation, you can see the difference here between the current HCP layers and what's in the consolidated layer. You can also see the difference here with interior habitat. So that's beyond the edge effect area within each of these polygons, as well as an outer and inner edge. So that edge zone, what we're calling the edge effect evaluation zone, has an inner and an outer edge. So there's the first 0 to 50 meters and then the 50 to 100 meters. Okay, discussion point 4 involves conserving the consolidated murrelet habitat layer, or putting protections on using that layer, but applying adaptive management. So allowing for harvest in extensive sands shown to be unoccupied through surveys or monitoring, and or lower retention levels based on results of the murrelet experiment that's outlined in the research proposal and the management plan. You can see there's a theme with some of these potential impacts around issuance criteria for the ITP. This version protects occupied murrelet habitat and potentially allows for a higher degree of harvest in unoccupied potential habitat relative to the previous decision point. This still may limit extensive harvest experimentation in older forests. This possibly maintains the research design, but with a high degree of uncertainty, at least for what we know right now, because decisions through adaptive management would be based on surveys and monitoring and couldn't be predicted at this stage. This impacts the financials again, but a high degree of uncertainty as to the extent. Increase the process for clearing harvest operations and also create some difficulties in assessing ESA take because of the uncertainty associated with this point. And then again, potentially limits options for other species, and there may be others to discuss as well. Two more. Discussion point 5, conserving the consolidated murrelet habitat layer, but increasing a 1,400 acre cap on the high retention harvest that in the HCP applies to occupied. Again, may meet ITP issuance criteria depending on the take analysis, protects occupied murrelet habitat, maintains functional buffers, existing edge conditions. Again, a high degree of uncertainty to how this impacts the financials. There's still an impact on the research design, in particular the Triad E subwatersheds, and limits extensive harvest to high retention in more areas of older forest than are currently in the HCP layers. And then discussion point 6, offset impacts to financial viability from any of the previous decision points, or address viability regardless of any impacts beyond the status quo by revising treatment approach in portions of this conservation research watersheds and or partial watersheds in the MRW. There's a typo there. So very similar to others, questions about financial viability. This may improve depending on what decisions are made and really what the options are based on the research design, the treatments, and the current age class distribution in those areas. Won't address impacts to the Triad research design encouraged by the other decision points specifically within the MRW. Potentially increases fragmentation in the CRW or edge effect impacts related to the partials depending on how this is designed. And could decrease available mitigation credit area and contiguous conservation area, particularly related to the CRW. So that's a lot to take in. As Brett said, there was a discussion of the subgroup last week, and we talked about many of these points, but it was also a fairly quick conversation with that group too, a lot to get through in a couple of hours that we met. And so those are ongoing conversations and something that is also part of the retreat agenda moving forward.
Yeah, I think to be fair, we got into a lot during that subgroup meeting, and then these particular slides we went through at a cursory level, and we wanted to show them to you all today, but there is still an ongoing process with the subgroup to get their feedback on it. And while we're doing that, I think we wanted to use them with everybody, knowing that we're going to talk about this at the retreat. Yeah, Shannon, if I could, I mean, part of the overall context, and I don't want to do too much who's not here, but in a little bit, I think we need to be fair and represent some of what we heard. Can you hear me all okay? Okay, weird. I just got a prompt from the internet.
You froze for a minute, Brett, but we can hear you now.
Okay, you can hear me now, Paul, or thumbs up, Tom?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Weird stuff's happening. I think to be fair to what we heard, the general context is, even if the last board meeting, I think we presented some numbers of, if you were to apply buffers on all the occupied habitat, it results in a massive number that I think has a lot of potential impacts on the research design and the financials. So even in the discussion point 2, the 150-foot buffer selectively applied to, certain areas, it's still, it doesn't represent that number that or doesn't result in that number that you saw earlier. It's a far smaller number, but nothing here is without costs. And I think that's been part of the feedback is, if you do a prescriptive buffer of 150 feet on the occupied, it consumes acres, and we would need to figure out how to offset that to keep the financials balanced. So I think some of what we heard was any impacts of the financials at this point are a major problem, because there's the perception that already the financial viability is concerning. And I think Paul and Colin are exhibit A. I mean, you've all heard it from them, and that's where I don't want to speak for them, but Paul's letter speaks to it, and I think you've heard it all from Colin in the past, as well as Paul. So I think we've also heard, and I would let other members of the subgroup, Bob, Teresa, speak for yourselves on it, but I think we've heard, well, maybe there's a more creative way to resolving this that doesn't quote unquote tie up so many acres, but that does focus on the interests of consolidating important habitat and avoiding edge or fragmentation impacts. And that's where some of the consolidated layer could come in helpfully. And where I think, you know, this discussion, so you get into that in different variations on discussion point 3 and 4, and the adaptive management part of it, as well as increasing the cap on the 1,400 acre experiment, are considerations that we've thrown out there that would provide some more flexibility to, I think, address the experiment, the research design that is, and the financials. Discussion point 6 is really, you know, regardless of where the problem solving lands around the murrelet issue, there are some ideas around the CRW and the partial watersheds in the MRW that could stay out of impacting areas where you've got murrelet or spotted owl habitat, and, you know, focus on areas that are outside of those areas but under 65 years old, and, you know, potentially, you know, near the existing road network, where depending on where the prospective board wants to focus its feedback in the financial viability context, there are some options there to consider. So we've got some, we have needs for kind of problem solving this and getting feedback. I'd invite, you know, Bob or Teresa or anybody else from OSU who's been in these conversations to say anything more. I think the flavor from Paul and Colin is they have concerns over the existing financial viability. They've made it clear anything that can increase flexibility they would like to see, but they also have a pretty firm, and I would say a pretty clear belief that work needs to be done to do something to address the financial viability regardless of the HCP.
So let's pause there and see if there are comments from board members or questions, things to address. Bob? You flapped your hand. I wasn't sure how to interpret it. You're on mute.
I was doing my injured one-winged bird imitation. Yeah, no, I appreciate all the work that's going into this. I think it's super helpful. I think some of the maps that are emerging are really informative. I know it's stressful, but I think, you know, we were bound to have this stressful kind of end game no matter what. You know, everything comes to a crunch, right? We're trying to really get the final numbers on budget. We're trying to get the final numbers on acres and volume, and hoping that all that stuff fits together seamlessly, which, you know, it doesn't. I guess I look at this to some degree as complex fine tuning to try and maximize the functionality of, you know, what we've said we want to achieve, all the different goals. And, you know, I am actually fairly heartened by some of the maps and the data that's coming out. I think that there are ways to get there. I understand that we're on the edge financially. We always kind of knew that. But I don't know. I'm rambling here, and I don't have much more to add than that. But I guess I feel like the data that's coming out is super helpful. Gives us something to really kind of play around with, and I feel relatively confident in it. The last thing I'll just say is I think extensive was always meant to be, you know, how do you do this well? How do you get wood off the forest and also preserve the complexity, increase the complexity, increase the highest priority values? That's really the discussion we're having right now, right? I mean, around the murrelets, because murrelets are a good surrogate for the values we want to preserve. And so how do you take extensive forestry in particular and use that in the optimal way on the landscape that gets you both wood, but also gets you greater levels of connectivity, greater levels of buffering, and so on. So I think in some ways this is the hard work, but it's also the fun work of what we've taken on as an overall goal. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Bob. Others? Okay. I want to just emphasize that yeah, that the hope wasn't to necessarily resolve this, but to position you all to not to resolve it today, but to position you by providing this information and sort of level setting all the board members with this information today, that as we go into conversations next week, and we're sort of fine tuning where the direction that you all have in terms of trying to address these competing challenges and topics, that you're positioned to be able to make provide informed guidance to folks, as early as next week. So thanks for sitting through some difficult conversations and a lot of information. And yeah, Teresa, go ahead.
Yeah, just so I know that Deanne and others had said there was going to be a little more analysis into what the edge habitat actually was like along that new layer. And I know that's a lot of work to be done, but I'm curious if there's going to be more information on that by the retreat or not, just for further discussion.
On the take analysis side, our role at this stage has really been providing technical assistance in the conversations with DSL and Fish and Wildlife, and the work that Deanne has done on the spatial analysis alongside working to develop a draft framework that can be adjusted by through conversations with the services. That's really where we're at right now. I guess I'd look to Brett for his thoughts on sort of how this is fitting in with conversations with the services overall, and the timeline for the HCP and where you're trying to get those conversations to.
I'm not, yeah, I'll take a shot. I'm not sure, Teresa, if this gets at it. Or if Deanne, you've got any direct response on the kind of edge analysis piece, but I think so there hasn't been a lot of experience in the public forest context. Well, I guess two things. One, the state of knowledge around marble murrelets is evolving and limited. And I'm going to say this from a non-biologist and not somebody who's in the weeds of all of this, but just as my impression of the conversations. And so there's that. The Fish and Wildlife Service hasn't had a ton of experience permitting these kinds of things. Murrelet impacts under the Endangered Species Act. There is on public land, there's a relevant Washington State Department of Natural Resources, HCP, in a 2019 amendment that we feel like is useful in looking at how, and this is what OSU's been looking at and helping with the take analysis along with ICF, is looking at how take effects were analyzed and assessed there. And so this relates to, I think, there's collaborative work happening with the with the Fish and Wildlife Service and OSU involved around what a framework for take analysis could look like. And DSL as the applicants, leading that and wanting to see it. But I guess I'd come back to you all DSL will move forward with an HCP revision and a proposal based on the timeline regardless, and we have to, as the applicant, it's our charge. And given that I think we're talking about changes to the design on the forest and certain agreements that have been made so far, whether it's related to harvest cap or how the different layers play out on the forest with respect to the CRW, and then within the MRW, the extensives and the intensive allocations. These are we're in a conversation about change, and change conversations are inherently uncomfortable, but now's the time that we need to be having it. And I think what we're trying to do is make sure, given that we're talking about a bigger picture change in design to resolve issues, whether they're the financial things that some folks are pressing on the Prospective board, or conservation things that others are pressing on. As the applicant on the HCP, we don't want to do it in isolation. And so I would like to maybe hear a little more on knowing that we're just hitting you with those discussion point slides. And there's still work to do between now and the retreat with the subset of the board, the subgroup members, around their take on how to problem solve this. What would be helpful for the full board? I mean, coming into the retreat, we can use those slides that Shannon and I just walked through. We could try to come up with something that's a little more focused around here. You know, here is one or two or a couple pathways to potentially land the plane. I'd like to, I think just hearing a little more on what would be helpful to you all coming into the retreat, knowing that we're going to talk more with the subset of Bob, Teresa, Paul, and Colin, and Jennifer. I know is crazy busy, but yeah, let me know. And Teresa, I have no idea whether that helped in answering your question.
I think let's
Yeah.
follow.
So wait, before you
No,
answer,
so
Teresa, let's let Deanne talk.
Yeah.
Let me follow the thread that you just posed to the broader group, and then Deanne, we'll get back to you on the edge effects piece, which I think you're prepared to do, if we can. So any board members have reflections? I think really, Brett, what you're saying is, would it be helpful to the board to come in with some options that potentially attempt to provide a balanced approach, or a couple of different scenarios that really try to, address these issues in a way that's, deals with the balance of financial and conservation needs and the research needs?
Yeah, thanks, Peter. And in the context of, we can't, given the timeline and the work that has to be done, we can't come out of this retreat with, question marks around the edges, but conceptually where we're going, I think we need to come out of this retreat with clarity.
Mike?
For me, one thing that would be really helpful, attached to each of these different scenarios, if we could have for the retreat a large scale map that you put up on a wall that would show what the effects of each of these things would be. You can kind of tell sort of a little bit on the screen of the computer, but for the most part, it's indistinguishable from one to the other, really. So a big map to put up on the wall. I'm a very visual person. If I could look at that, that would be very helpful.
I see others nodding their heads in agreement, Mike. Yeah.
Is there going to be someone there with like GIS on their computer who could have that projected and take layers on and off if people needed? Because I think that would potentially be more helpful than a static map from my perspective.
BSL can probably supply the projector if OSU can help with the layers.
I agree, that would be helpful, and I also think having some kind of a large, a physical map would be helpful to have there, because I think it's easier to stand in front of something when you're together in person and talk about things, so I think both and.
We will work to provide both. Anything else that would be helpful for the board?
No, I think, I guess I'll just echo that. I think something that can help, what you were saying, would it be helpful to bring some scenarios? Or, I mean, I think building on what we've just been talking through and hearing about, yes, it's super helpful to understand scenarios, because I think then you can get into the trade-offs question, like understanding what the options are. And maybe there's something that ends up being something that's none of the actual scenarios brought into the conversation. It is something that's, a synthesis or something in between, but that can help us explore them in more depth, I think would be super helpful.
Thanks, Jennifer. Anyone else? Yeah, Teresa, go ahead.
Yeah, I think for me, that was what I was trying to get at with my original question, a little bit more information about what is on that edge habitat surrounding it, as far as like what the current status is and what the allocations around it are for the research design would be helpful, and potentially a little more information as to some of the discussion points Shannon brought up, where there would be, in one scenario, more extensive harvest, and in one scenario, less extensive harvest. Like, why is that? And what does that look like? And what are those acreages? And that kind of stuff would be good to kind of actually visualize what you're talking about.
Thanks, Teresa. So let me come to Deanne.
Okay, I just wanted to respond to Teresa's original question about alternatives or options with regard to edge effect. And of course, the edge effect analysis is just part of the overall take analysis that would be done under the HCP. If you notice on those scenarios that Shannon was talking about, and she mentioned it, I think each one of those said this all depends on the issue of the take analysis and issuance criteria for the incidental take permit. And I think just conceptually, I think it's real good to think of I don't like the term take analysis because it implies take, of course, the term's there, but it's really an accounting. It's just exactly like the financial accounting. We wouldn't dare go into this endeavor without understanding financial consequences. And it's the same thing with our threatened and endangered species, whether it's coho here, or northern spotted owl, or marbled murrelet. And the take analysis is very much an accounting process, but unfortunately, unlike financial accounting, that accounting process isn't defined. And that's what we're trying to do. Jen and I are working with Fish and Wildlife and with a consultant looking at the framework in the Washington DNR. We really need a framework for understanding that accounting, because fundamentally, we need to, all said and done, we need as many birds when we finish this project as when we started. And whether you account for those birds by acres or actual birds, which we can't do, there's got to be some kind of an accounting process. Otherwise, we're just flying blind, if you'll pardon the pun. So that there's a real, I just want to emphasize that the accounting for take is a really key part here. And there's not just one solution, there's alternatives. So whatever that accounting methodology is that we wind up with, there'll be different ways to get to the end result, which is at a minimum, not resulting in take. So I just wanted to mention that, to maybe think of it in those terms, that there are alternatives, but we need an analytical framework for determining what those are, just like we have financial accounting rules.
But Deanne, I mean, just to be clear, we're not talking about an HCP that is a no-take HCP. I mean, the point of getting an HCP and the permits is to permit some level of take. I think, Deanne, I don't think we're talking.
No, you're right. No, you're right. I misspoke, but it is, but the no net loss.
Yeah, the accounting of how we do it is key.
Thanks, Deanne. Thanks, Brett. And then Teresa. And before you jump in there, Teresa, just so I say it, so far I've got Peggy Lynch signed up for public comment, nobody else. If you're a member of public and want to make a comment, please let me know ASAP. Teresa and then Tom.
Thanks. Yeah, just a follow-up question. Maybe I wasn't clear in my initial question. What I'm wondering, and thanks for that that explanation, Dan, but I'm wondering if you will have more information on that analysis you're doing. So when we last talked, you said you were going to try and look at, say, what percentage of the edge you've calculated that exists around that consolidated habitat is already, in a young age class, so it would be a hard edge. How much of it is in an older age class, so it's a soft edge? How much is mature for it? That kind of thing, so that we can get an understanding, or just like and I know we're not the ones doing the analysis, but for us, I think it'd be, or for me, it'd be really helpful to know, what does that edge look like? How much is hard edge? How much is soft edge? And then how much of it is going to be hard edge later? Like how much is intensive around the edges and that kind of thing. So that's what I was wondering, if you have like a timeline for when you're going to know more about that.
We can run numbers like that now, but the take analysis is U.S. Fish and Wildlife responsibility, and so we can provide them layers, and we can maybe help them with develop an analytical framework. But before we go further than where we are right now, for instance, we have the consolidated layer. Is that something Fish and Wildlife buys off on? We can run with that analysis using that layer, but that may not ultimately be what Fish and Wildlife wants to go forth with. Same thing. There's some other parameters that they need to accept, that they would use. We can run with some of these expected parameters, and the problem with that is maybe it's not going to result in the same accounting that Fish and Wildlife might, and so the effort is for naught.
Thanks, Dan. Tom? Oh, you're still on mute.
I thought I clicked, I must have double clicked it, not right back on mute. I just want to make the point briefly here that this is an enormous amount of work that our team's been doing for this analysis. And I guess I'd like to know, first of all, if it's realistic to, it sounds simple, just put it in a graphical form, put it on, put up different layers. This is work that OSU shouldn't have even been doing, and yet we're doing. And this is part and parcel of, why so often people are like, what, questioning timelines and for example, on the FMP, when our focus ends up getting pulled completely into the HCP to be able to complete analyses that were supposed to be done by a consulting firm for, working for DSL, we've had to step in and pick up a lot of slack. And it's not to critique or criticize the consulting firm, it's to say this is just an enormous amount of work, and the work that Deanne has done to accomplish what has been accomplished thus far is amazing, and she deserves an enormous amount of credit. We're also, navigating uncharted territory here, and to some degree, we've been fortunate to have input and help from Mike Buffo, who's the consultant for on the financials, but also happened to work on the Washington DNR HCP and has direct experience from that. So that's made a big difference as well. So I guess the point is that let's see, first of all, I want to be realistic about what we can deliver in time for the board meeting, and two, I guess that question goes to our to our team to, you know, what's realistic, what can be produced, and so that there's not an expectation of something that that would be difficult to deliver at that time frame. And then yeah, and two, whether or not individuals that are key in this effort have even been, you know, invited to the retreat or are planning to attend the retreat. One other point I just want to make, I guess, because it was, you know, it relates to the financial analysis as well as, and I guess Jennifer kind of asked for this when she said, I would like context. I'd like us to back up and look at the research proposal and how we got to this point. And the same is true with, you know, looking at the financials or looking at now where we are with the HCP. Is a brief run through history might help put things in context for the board, so they don't think that we just got here by bumbling. We got here by, we agreed on certain things, and we, you know, we laid out a plan and a plan of action of how to get from one step to the next. And then different barriers have been thrown into, or different, you know, challenges have been thrown into the mix. With the financial analysis, you know, we have to recall when we're being asked to do this detailed output on different scenario testing again, and trying to come up with an absolute number of what it is going to be. That's what's gotten us into some trouble in the past. We presented a number based on modeling. All models are wrong. We know it. We know no model is 100% correct. And it's not until we get out and actually start harvesting timber and setting up research, the research plots, that we'll really know the actual exact figures. But models are exceptionally useful in giving us an idea of where we're going to land. And I just think we need to keep that in mind, that the range that was being talked about, I think Eric mentioned, is so much more valuable than an absolute number, because the absolute number will be wrong. And then we'll be brought, you know, that'll be brought back we'll be brought to task for it. And that's happened in the past, where a single number in the research proposal is brought back and used as an example of, here's exactly what you said you would achieve, and you need to be held to it. So I just think of stepping back, to having that context of where we said we would go with the research proposal, and then a step through history of how we've gotten to where we are today with the FMP, with the HCP, and with the financials would be really valuable before launching into any of the next steps during the retreat. So I just am appreciating Jennifer's suggestion. I think it's a good one, and not just for Jennifer, but for all of us.
Thanks, Tom, and noted for the agenda planning. And also, I appreciate you reminding us of the ask of your team in preparing stuff for that retreat. And we'll be cognizant of trying to be both attentive to what's been requested, but not oversubscribing folks in trying to meet those intentions.
Thanks, Peter. I just want to be realistic and make sure that we can deliver what we're asked to deliver.
Bet.
I want to comment on that. I appreciate what Tom is saying. And if there is someone that you believe, Tom, from your team that needs to be at the retreat to help explain these things, you need to let us know, so they can either come for the day, or if you think it's helpful, we can get another room, but we do need to act on that pretty quickly.
Great. Thank you, Vicki. We'll do.
Okay.
Great. Anything else on this? Yeah, Mike?
Just the only thing that's related to is the retreat itself. I happen to notice in both on the invitation that there's one part that says it starts at 9 and one part that says it starts at 10. So I just wanted to be sure of what time I need to show up.
Yeah, we've been adjusting that, and we'll send out. I'll do it now, and since you raised it, I was gonna address that yet before we adjourned. But and so first and foremost, we're in the process of engaging and kind of refining the agenda, and wanted to have today's conversation for precisely this type of input, so that we could ensure that the agenda was as reflective of your intents as it was to also the topics we know that need to be addressed. So you can expect a detailed agenda in the next day or two. In the meantime, we are planning to start at like 10 a.m. approximately. So there are a few folks that are planning to stay overnight on Sunday. Most people, I think, will be traveling down the Monday morning. And so we're hoping that around 10 a.m. we could start. And then on Tuesday, we'll try to conclude approximately 3:30, so that folks have time to get back to their homes and whatnot before too late into the evening. We'll have pretty full days and a dinner together on Monday evening. So broad architecture, at least in terms of the timelines. Plan on 10 a.m. I think we can make accommodations, and if you want or need to be there on Sunday evening and travel in the morning didn't work for you. And again, plan for an agenda coming soon.
And
Right.
we're going to feed you more than just dinner on Monday.
Thanks. Yes. Sorry. Just not during the meeting times, but everything's available on site. Good. All right. So I think that's enough on the retreat agenda stuff. Bob, on the previous topic? Yeah, go for it. And then Peggy, I haven't forgotten about you.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I hear what you're saying, Tom, and I want to be open to it. At the same time, the commitments that were made were important. So the numbers come up or they change. It is a big deal. We went out and sold this to our various constituencies based on largely numbers. So that's where the rubber hits the road. And, I appreciate the challenge. I want to make sure that we're being realistic about next week because we are at the end game again. We seem to always get here. And, we made a strategic decision to shift from the stakeholder board to this new board. But to the degree to which we have time to really go through everything, get everybody grounded in everything, and then make really big decisions in a day and a half is maybe not totally realistic. So I just want to make sure we're really thinking about this because we're going to have to come out of this retreat with actual decisions. And does it make sense to really spend a lot of time going back over a lot of ground, or does it make sense to spend our limited time we have kind of bashing through the decisions that are in front of us? And I think to some degree, hopefully, and I know it's not a comfortable position to be in, but to some degree, I'm sure the long-term stakeholders will be more than happy to sort of weigh in where they think things are inconsistent, and you have folks kind of across the spectrum still to kind of weigh in where things seem inconsistent with what we did over the last 4 years.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. And you're right. This is it's come up at each of your meetings, and it is the dynamic of it's an unusual set of circumstances for this board. You are transitioning from an advisory committee, and many of the prospective board members have been engaged in an incredibly detailed set of conversations and negotiations around the research proposal. You're also transitioning to becoming a board, and you're still engaged in really detailed level conversations for some of you, and others don't have that same history. And you're also now acting more as a prospective board. You don't yet have decision-making responsibilities or capabilities, but you're in this transition space where you're sort of acting in both capacities. And it is unusual and at times a little complicated. And we will, as we try to structure the agenda, I had mentioned this at the outset, and I think some of this resonates, that we can't go completely back, but we do need to take the time to orient folks that are newer to these conversations to the history, and particularly the mission. That's your guiding principle. It's the North Star, Jennifer, that you mentioned at the first meeting. What's our North Star as we may provide input and / make decisions as you're trying to provide guidance? What is that North Star? We want to make sure everybody has that same orientation that's guiding their thinking as you think, work your way through these difficult topics and conversations. They're complex, and we want to make sure everybody's grounded with as much of the same information as possible, so that you are functioning together as a board. All right, Brett.
Well, I guess it's come up a few times now, so I don't want this to come off the wrong way. I think we need to be, as an agency, clear, like, okay, the current prospective board is still, advisory to DSL, and what we're trying to do, I mean, when it comes to the HCP, Tom, there are a few things you said that triggered this, I think, where like we can clearly move forward with the technical contractor that DSL's hired, and as the applicant on the HCP, move it forward. And what we're trying to do is not move, and related to that, I mean, there's work, I think the work that OSU's done is really helpful, and whether it was asked for or not, I think we're trying to do this in a context where the wheels don't fall off for anyone. So if we do an HCP as the applicant, we landed in a timeline that is required of us. Ideally, that doesn't mean OSU says we're no longer going to do this, or we can't do this under this kind of an HCP constraint. We don't want that outcome, and so it's not the intended approach, but we got to get an HCP. And so having that conversation around the research design is pretty fundamental to us. And I think we've gotten some signals that the wheels are close to falling off for a couple of people on this board who aren't here today. And I think when the mural buffer issue came up, it was a signal from others on the prospective board that the wheels may be falling off for them, because they were under the impression, right or wrong, that there were buffers on the trimas, and then it was clear, and it's now clear that there weren't. And so I mean, I think that feedback on the context of what keeps everybody on board is key. DSL still has to make some decisions as the applicant on the HCP. And I think what we're trying to do is not make sure we're not doing it in isolation.
Thanks, Brett. Anyone else? And I'd see you, Peggy. Anyone else on this topic as we move towards wrapping up? Okay. Peggy.
Thank you, and thank you for all the work that you've been doing. I do really appreciate it. I am sure what I didn't hear was at the retreat you were going to be making decisions, since it's not a public meeting.
Correct.
But that's not what I was really wanted to talk about. So for those of you who don't know, I'm Peggy Lynch, League of Women Voters of Oregon, and we have been involved with the Elliott for quite some time. And in 2015, we said that the best transition scenario and the best management strategy decouples the old growth forest clear cutting from the school funding, protects the Elliott's remaining native forests, wild salmon, imperiled wildlife, safeguards the Elliott's drinking water, public recreation and educational opportunities, and promotes timber jobs by restoratively thinning the second growth tree farms. That was back in 2015. And in 2020, we said we were worried about governance and fiscal finance issues. Thank you for solving the governance issue. I really do appreciate all of you being willing to work on this prospective board that will be an authority. But we still have concerns about the finance. And a major concern that we have is with the possibility of OSU's management of the forest is how they might be able to afford to manage the forest under the principles, and believe it, you should have the principles with you that the State Land Board adopted without over harvesting. It will be critical for the advisory committee and now you as the board to be sure that OSU's financial plan is solid and workable as they provide recommendations over the next year or two. That was back in 2020. And in 22, there's a document from Dan Newton dated October 24th, 2022 that says, in summary, relating to the yield, the modeled results upon which the OSU financial plan is based are in the neighborhood of 20% too high. So we continue to be concerned about that. And then in 2022, we suggested that the finance, we continue to have concerns, although OSU believes they can manage the research on the forest while not over harvesting beyond what is in the draft forest management plan. OSU and the yet to be adopted FMP and HCP will clearly guide any harvest. It is critical that the new management keeps a close eye on the revenue and expenses, and we're asking that of you. Balancing the harvest revenues and other grant funding with doing the proposed research, providing recreational and educational opportunities, and ongoing management of the forest is a big charge. And lastly, today, I have now heard that DSL may be going back to the state legislature and ask for additional monies beyond the POP 108 that was in their budget. And in March of this year, the league supported POP 108 of the budget. And I want to make sure that you understand that if there is going to be an adjustment to that POP 108, we would like to know, is it coming from the Common School Fund, which is what the original POP 108 would do, or is it coming from somewhere else? Because some of us promised the prior legislature that by paying off the Common School Fund for the forest, we wouldn't be back. So we have concerns and we just want to be kept in the loop. So thanks for all of your work, and I appreciate everything that you've done today. Hope that you understand why we care about the forest and the success of this authority and the success of OSU's research forest. Thank you.
Thanks, Peggy. And a little bit of a break potentially in protocol on that. We don't typically address, sort of respond to queries or questions directly, but I think it's appropriate in this particular, for instance, just because I want to make sure the board members are clear on a couple of things. One, I think it's helpful. You raised Dan Newton and the 20% reduction. I just wanted to clarify for folks that Dan has been engaged in those subgroup conversations, and those 20% reductions in terms of scenario planning have been incorporated. So there has been work since that the report mentioned. And then Vicki, I thought you may want to address the other question about the legislation.
Yes, thank you. Thanks, Peggy, for bringing all those to our attention. Our LFO analyst has been sitting on this meeting the entire time as well. And we've had deep conversations with him about how to go forward and provide some bridge funding to the board. The problem is the board can't be a board without money to stand up the authority. And I'm not interested in these fine folks serving for another entire year or something without being a board with decision-making responsibilities. So we are looking at supplementing our POP 108 And at this time, it would be coming from the Common School Fund unless there's another resource. But you're always going to be kept in the loop about what we're doing because we operate in transparency and in the daylight. So you'll know about all of that.
Thank you. And thank you both for answering my questions, even though I know you don't usually do that.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Peggy. Thanks, Vicky. Any closing remarks from the board before we adjourn? The only sort of logistical housekeeping item I have for you is just to keep an eye on your emails. We're gonna both be sending an agenda. We also need, after this, we've got to get another set of meetings on your calendars. So we're going to need some dates from you. So just be aware of that. I won't put you through anything right now. Any closing reflections or remarks before we adjourn?
I just want to appreciate everyone the hard work that's gone on to this on all fronts. I mean, it's a lot to absorb in a board meeting, and I just what that brings home to me is how much incredible work is going on a day-to-day basis on this. So I just want to thank everyone for that.
Thanks, Jennifer. Vicky.
I'll echo Jennifer's comment and then just reiterate that if there's anything that you all need to help you make some decisions, informal decisions, have conversation before the retreat, please let us know in advance. If any of you have changed your mind, you'd like to stay an extra night, please let us know that as soon as possible. This is Monday and our retreat's only a week away. We're trying to make this an event where you can actually sit down without any distractions. You're not going to be on your computers and your phones. Well, you will be, but we're looking forward to really having these conversations, these hard, tough conversations. This one about marbled murrelet is, I don't know, it's a bit overwhelming because it's one that we've not wanted to deal with, but we have to deal with, and just look forward to having conversation and keeping your cool, and know that, as Bob says this a lot, we're going to work through it. So I'm going to take that to the bank. Well, not the Silicon Valley Bank, but at least our bank. We're going to get it done. So thanks. I'll see you all next Monday.
Thanks, Vicky. Anyone else? All right. Thanks, everybody, for your time this afternoon, for all the hard work that's going on behind the scenes, and we'll be in touch.